I'm Danny Fallon, and I would like to welcome you to the inaugural symposium of the Wendy Klag Center for Autism and Developmental Disabilities. This is a great moment for many of us who have helped to plan not only this event, but the center itself, and particularly for Dean Klag and his family, for whom this center is named. And I think autism and developmental disabilities broadly are important and touch many of us. Most of you in this room are either touched personally or certainly have friends or colleagues that are touched personally because of the prevalence of these disorders. So we're very happy that you're here to share this day with us and to hear a little bit about some of the research that's going on in these domains. So the history here in Baltimore for autism and developmental disorders is extremely rich. From the early days in the School of Medicine of actually identifying and characterizing autistic disorder to modern day cutting edge research happening in the School of Medicine, particularly at Kennedy Krieger Institute and here in the School of Public Health, amongst others, in all sorts of domains, from early detection and intervention to characterization through imaging and molecular characterization to understanding risk factors and even to characterizing the prevalence of this disorder in the U.S. And more emerging topics of thinking about that more globally and more emergent topics of thinking about it from policy and other perspectives. And so we see the center as an opportunity to really take that rich history and that current cutting edge environment and make a public health footprint in that kind of effort. We are sitting in what I think is one of the best schools of public health in the world. And I think it's our obligation, in fact, if we're passionate about this area, to make sure that we can contribute to what's already going on in Baltimore. And so I'm very excited about the partnerships, and you'll hear throughout the day folks from Kennedy Krieger and from School of Medicine and from our School of Public Health, as well as our colleagues across this country who are doing really important research through that public health prism of autism and developmental disabilities more generally. And so I will leave it at that with a final welcome and a couple of saying hellos during the afternoon. But right now I'd like to pass the attention over to Dean Klag.
Thank you, Danny. And everybody probably knows Danny, but I'll just tell you her position in the school. So Danny is a very well-known genetic epidemiologist who works in neuropsychiatric disorders and diseases of aging, was in the Department of Epidemiology, and I'm very happy assumed the chairmanship of the Department of Mental Health this year. But I have to say, all the time we were talking about that and negotiating, you never said to me that you thought we were one of the best schools of public health. Because that's like the litmus test. If you think that, I don't know, we would have gotten to go. So, but thank you, and thank you for your leadership of the center, and also to Janet DePietro, who we'll hear from later as the associate director. So this is a big day for me personally, and a big day for my family. And I just want to introduce my daughter Julia, my oldest daughter, who's here. And my wife, Lou Simeone. And I think we're expecting Aaron to show, coming a little bit later. So let me welcome you to this inaugural symposium. And obviously the center is named for my first wife, Wendy Klag, who was just incredibly devoted to the issue of well-being of children, especially the children with developmental disabilities. But we're here not so much to talk about her, but to talk about the future of autism research and what we're going to be doing as an institution, working across all of Hopkins and other partners to improve the quality and state and really try to bring new resources to the battle against autism. So I'm here because I'm presenting the highest honor that our school can give today, and that's a Dean's Medal to Suzanne and Bob Wright, who are the co-founders of Autism Speaks. And everybody who cares about the issue of autism and developmental disabilities knows their name. Everybody knows Bob and Suzanne Wright, so they don't need an introduction. But if I don't give the introduction, I'm not able then to have any time at the podium. So bear with me, Bob, as I go through the introduction. when my daughter was diagnosed with autism, it's such a difficult. The word autism is always coupled with the word incurable disease. You know, it's always incurable, and there's lots of things that are incurable, but we don't say it about anything, it seems to me, other than autism. And so all of us have been inspired by the work of Bob and Suzanne, and they initiated their work because of their grandson Christian, who suffers from autism. Bob and Suzanne founded Autism Speaks, which is the leading autism science and advocacy group, in February of 2005. It's just hard to believe it's been that short a time. The amount of the accomplishments have been incredible. And when they did that, they really united many different factions who cared about autism, both from the advocacy point of view and from science. Autism Speaks is dedicated to funding research into the causes, prevention, treatment, and cures for autism, and increasing awareness of autism spectrum disorders, and advocating for the needs of individuals with autism and their families. In addition to funding research, Autism Speaks has created resources and programs, including the Autism Speaks Autism Treatment Network, the Genetic Resource Exchange, and several other scientific and clinical programs. They have created awareness around the globe for the issue of autism and autism spectrum disorders, including the annual United Nations sanctioned World Autism Awareness Day on April 2, which Autism Speaks celebrates through its Light It Up in Blue initiative. And Suzanne is especially a strong proponent of that. And I have to say, she's not here today because she's unable to travel, but it's hard to say no to Suzanne Wright. So when she asks you to light up the school in blue, you do it. And then there's the award-winning Learn the Signs campaign, which the Ad Council has received over $300 million in donated media. The family resources include the Autism Speaks Autism Video Glossary, a 100-day kit for newly diagnosed families, a school community toolkit, a grandparent school kit, and the community grant programs. None of those resources were available when my daughter was diagnosed. So since you founded Autism Speaks, it's just had a tremendous impact. It's raised $450 million and committed over $195 million to research and developing innovative new resources. You and Suzanne have shown incredible vision and leadership in advancing the public awareness of autism spectrum disorders and advocating for research to understand, treat, and prevent these conditions, not only here but around the world. And I think I've been fortunate to be at the UN twice with Suzanne and Bob to speak about autism, and it's through their advocacy that there was a resolution passed by all the member nations of the UN to promote detection, treatments, and awareness of autism. So you've received lots of awards, and I'll just say a few and share the luster. You were one of Time's 100 top, let me turn the page here, heroes and pioneers. They've also received the first ever Double Helix Award for Corporate Leadership from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, the NYU Child Advocacy Award, the Castle Connolly National Health Leadership Award, the American Ireland Fund Humanitarian Award, the Citizens United for Research in Epilepsy 2011 Leadership Award, and the Eugene M. Lang Lifetime Achievement Award from the I Have a Dream Foundation. In addition to Bob's work in Autism Speaks, he's had an extensive, successful career in business and the law. He served as Vice President of General Electric and President, CEO and Chairman of NBC and NBC Universal from 1986 to 2007. And prior to that, he was President of General Electric Financial Services. Bob serves as a senior advisor of THL Capital and serves on the board of directors of the Ralph Lauren Polo Corporation, Mission Product LLC, AMC Networks, and is a trustee of the New York Presbyterian Hospital. He became CEO and chairman of the Palm Beach Civic Association in 2010. Bob Wright is a graduate of the College of the Holy Cross and the Law School of the University of Virginia. Suzanne graduated from Sarah Lawrence and is trustee emeritus of Sarah Lawrence College. The Wrights have 3 children, and we're very fortunate to welcome Karen here today. Thank you for coming. And 6 grandchildren. I want to thank everybody from Autism Speaks who came down to be with us today. So Bob, I'd like to ask you to come up to the podium, please, so I can give you the award. So this is the award. It says Bob Wright for worldwide advocacy on behalf of individuals with autism and their families, October 15, 2013. And I get to hang this around your neck here. Okay, then you get your picture taken. Okay, that's it. There we go. Thank you for everything you did.
Thank you, Dean Michael. You're sitting next to Karen, a.k.a. Katie. You did wonderful. You did wonderful. We had the opportunity to meet a few years ago when we first started and had a great conversation. I think you had just assumed the position as dean down here, and it was a wonderful, revealing conversation of a dad who is intimately involved in the family history and so forth, and we're proud to be here. We really are very proud. I had an opportunity to tour the school today, and it is quite a spot. I've known Michael Bloomberg for a long time, and he hasn't changed a bit, by the way. If anybody care to know that, it's the same exact person he was when he first started his business, from nothing, and he's just got that drive and determination, and it really, this is just a wonderful place in history. Thank you very much for the recognition and the award. There are two people that really stand out in my life on this, and one of them sitting next to you is Katie. Katie is the mother of Christian, and Christian is the primary driver of why I'm here. And my wife, Suzanne, is really our chief advocate and head of passion. She has injured her knee and is in a bad situation right now. We're trying to figure out how to. Anybody know a good doctor we could? It's too late for prevention, so I guess the school can't help us. But she couldn't come down here. Hopefully she will be better very soon. But I'm saying on behalf of our family, especially, thank you very, very much. And he's sitting next to Gary Goldstein, who has been the head of Kennedy Krieger for many years and been on our board and our chief advisor on all the science issues since we started, along with Bernie Marcus, who's not here today, who was our first investor and strongest supporter. So Gary, thank you very much for being here. Good, continue a great work at Kennedy Krieger. I wanted to talk about some of the things that have happened with autism and what we are doing and what we have done and what the world has done, and maybe where we can go from there. First of all, we need all of you. We need people. We need a community. We need bright minds. We need the biggest souls to study and to research and share ideas, get into the lab, into the schools, and in the halls of Congress, and also get out of the United States, too. We found that to be a stimulating effort. We still say the word autism, and we teach everyone what it means every time we have a chance to do that, but we still need so much science, just so much science here, and we need a lot of treatments that are inexpensive and productive. And one of the great fortunes we've had is we have established a connection with the World Health Organization, which was very difficult to do. Surprisingly, I went over there in 2005, and I was giving a speech on behalf of General Electric at the time, and I went over to see the World Health Organization. I talked about Autism Speaks, and they said, "Oh, we know all about it. I mean, we know about it." And I said, "Well, you really, do you know a lot about autism?" "Oh, yeah, we have many people here. We follow the epidemiology and all this sort of thing." I said, "But my observation is you don't do anything about it." And they all went and said, "We can't. We're not authorized. We can't deal with any subject matter unless it's approved by the UN. And it has to be given to us on a priority basis. So our hands are tied." So that's when we began the effort at the UN. And we subsequently had ourselves declared as an official NGO of the United Nations. We got resolutions passed, and all of a sudden the WHO is in there pitching. And with countries like Bangladesh, as an example, many other countries you wouldn't probably think of, like Albania, we have really opened the door. They now are embraced with autism, and they're specially interested in the epidemiology, but they're also interested in treatments that are very affordable, that can be done on a community basis, and they can be done in countries all over the world. So that's a big issue. We also have an organization called the Global Autism Public Health Initiative, which is headed up by Andy Shee, Dr. Andy Shee, who's traveled the world on behalf of Autism Speaks. And Andy, where are you here today? He's not here. He's probably not in the country. That's probably the problem. But Andy has put together enormous efforts. We have 42 countries now that are involved with us on our initiatives. And we would love to invite and beg to have the esteemed Bloomberg School of Public Health join us in that effort. You have so many graduates from here that are around the world acting as ministers of health and so forth in other countries. It would be helpful. And we have come a long way on a very short time trying to mobilize countries. I'll give you an example. At the end of this month, the First Lady of Panama is hosting a conference in Panama, and it's only for Spanish-speaking countries and Portugal and South America. So Brazil will be there, and everything is going to be around Spanish people, treatments, histories, and all about autism. And it's the first time anybody's done this. And we're not the organizers now. We're the supporters, the facilitators, if you will. But the First Lady and the President of Panama are the ones that are supporting this. So this is a unique sort of a thing, and we have something like that in Indonesia. We have an effort like that in Bangladesh. And notice these are not generally the most developed countries. They tend to not want to participate as much as you would like, and yet the countries that are struggling, that have their own economies developing, have huge issues, they're very eager to become involved. So we could use your expertise and your connections around the world. These are real things that are going on right now, and I'm very proud to be associated with that. We try to need to connect the dots. The dots are all over the place. When we have a genetic discovery, we have a new treatment, we have a great lesson plan that it may be happening in Sydney, but it means nothing here in Maryland unless we all communicate. A lot of that's going to be communicating in person. Yes, we have all the other kinds of tools that you can think of, but we are all of us are the voices for this group of adults and children that are voiceless. Even if they have voice, they don't able to participate. They're not participating in regulations. They're not participating in curriculums at medical schools or colleges. They just don't have any ability to participate, and that's us. So aside from texting and posting and tweeting in the 21st century, we still have to communicate by mouth. Many of our children, of course, can't talk. And so we are even further challenged by being their individual voices as opposed to just the body of the voices. My grandson, Christian, is not a speaker. He can't talk. He is the dream of our life when he was born. It was our first grandson. We have 6 grandchildren. But he can't tell us if he's hungry. He can't tell us if he loves us. He can't tell us that he has a name. And imagine being a parent, never having heard "I love you," never knowing that your son or daughter is in pain or had a bad dream, never knowing what they really don't know and what they do know about the world. So these parents, though, all have one thing in common. They're very observational. My daughter Katie's reality and the reality of 70 other million people in families around the world, and I'll get to that in a minute, those parents are the voices. Those parents have the working observations of living with autism. And I don't think we do a very good job of collecting and using that observational database. And I think that we're losing out on a tremendous resource. We have to find ways to channel that much more effectively than we do today. It's the only way the parents can survive is by the wit of their observational abilities. So as doctors, therapists, researchers, scientists, we all work with and for our children, and we need you and all of us to raise our observational skills to new heights. I already mentioned that there are 70 million people. We get to that in a simple way. You just take the U.S. data as it currently exists, and you look around the world, and you're going to get 70 million. You're going to get 70 million people that are directly affected with autism. Now, if you want to go and you look beyond that, you know that there's probably more like 1,400,000,000, because you have a whole group of people that, for every person that has autism, are relatively well informed or know a good deal about it. And that's people that are working with the child, from family members to teachers to aides to therapists to bus drivers to coaches. In some areas of the world, it's all the women in the village. Other places, it's neighbors, it's acquaintances, it's third cousins, and so forth like that. So we shouldn't be thinking today that people don't know about autism. They may not have the right terminology. They may not know exactly what it is they're dealing with, but they certainly see the presentation. They certainly see reactions to different therapies. They certainly see the needs for scientific and medical help. And they're all probably overcome by what they have to deal with. Suzanne and I began this organization for Christian, and his diagnosis rocked our family to the core. Now it's 8 years later. We're still leading this organization. We've got about 230 full-time people, most of them in the United States, but not all, and a lot of people like Dr. Andy Shee travel around the world considerably. We've done a lot, but we have a lot to do. I just want to show you a film in a second, but I'd like to mention the fact that a lot of things in autism have changed during the last 8 years. One thing is awareness. When we started, the awareness levels were in the 20 percentiles of people that had some awareness, could identify autism, maybe not understand exactly what it was, but had some identity. We now had that level, especially with people of marriage age, people that are married, that level is about 65%. Now that's pretty strong. And that level of identity is a lot stronger than, yes, I've heard the name, the level of identity, and those people that are in that 25 to 35 to 40-year-old group, that's pretty strong. They may go 3 or 4 sentences deep in terms of their awareness. That's very important to what I have to say comes next. We also have advanced a lot in early diagnosis, and we and others have put a lot of money into that effort. And as a matter of fact, that effort was heavily supported by us, and others, and it led to another breakthrough here, which is treatment. And during the last few years, we were successful, and others, to get ABA to be medically deemed necessary and available, certainly all over the United States, if not all over the world. And Dr. Jerry Dawson, who was our head of science for many years, was really instrumental in that effort. The papers that she had written and the work that she had done to get the medical necessity language to be available is changed a lot of things. All of that led us to get the Combating Autism Act passed. And since that happened in 2006 under President Bush and then extended under President Obama, we've had 7 years of an 8-year program, and that's $1.7 billion of research money, most of it handled directly by the NIH through grants. A lot of those grants have come here and they've come other places, but it's NIH governed. We don't really have as much say in that as I would like to think we would, but that's another story. But the reality is that's how much money has been, almost all of that $1.7 billion has been expended. There's only 1 year left on the current agreement. But I do want to say that that issue with the ABA was very important there. That then led to insurance, and we've gotten insurance in 34 states. Insurance which includes treatment for autism with speech, occupational, behavioral therapies with ABA without limitation, or with limitations that can go upwards of $40,000 or $50,000 a year, and especially in speech and occupational, where you were limited under most agreements for maybe 10 visits a year or something of that nature, and that's all maybe during the time. Ironically, that covers 75% of the population of the country. But even though we've gotten the medically necessary language, we've gotten that through, we fought insurance companies all over the United States, we fought medical groups, we fought groups at educational groups, that we won those battles, but we still have Congress. Congress is the responsible for anything mandated to large corporations that are self-insured. So we have this irony. In the states handles corporations that are not self-insured, which is most of them, but not most of the people. Fully half of working Americans work in corporations that are self-insured or the federal government. That's the other category that the Congress. That's half of the working population. And they have not mandated autism coverage, which is disgraceful because we got 75% covered in the states. And usually that happens like that, because it seems ridiculous if somebody works for a small company and they have autism insurance next door to somebody who works for GE, and GE doesn't provide it and is not under any obligation to provide it. And it seems to me it's just it's a fast fix, but that goes to show you the power of lobbyists to get, they all have 100 reasons why they don't want to do it. And so we have a program on December 12th through 14th. And it's a policy program, invites a lot of parents, and others will come to D.C., and we'll go directly to Congress on this and a whole series of other issues during that point in time. And our strongest advocates are our parents, our moms. They're the strongest advocates, and their children. And that's what we have to. You have to really go and be really tough with people that just want to ignore the obvious when it's just so inequitable to have that situation at this stage. I mentioned a little bit about the Global Public Health Initiative. That's a major issue for us. I would tell you one other thing we're embarked in now. I was going to say markers. A lot of work has been done on markers. It's been not as consequential as I had hoped. I had thought by now we would have had a lot of markers that were more usable than they are. I'm not giving up on it. I'm not pessimistic, but it has been very slow. One of the things we are now embarking, though, is whole genome sequencing. And this is something that we got involved in. It's a long story, and I won't take you through that. But because we have such a large base of material from 10,000 different people in several thousand families. And we have been collecting this material at a degree for a long time. And we have all the phenotyping that goes with all of those samples. So the issue of whole genome sequencing, which, as you all know, is not approved or is not utilized by the NIH, which I think is going to look like a historical artifact in about 2 years, that gives us the opportunity to break out and match out particular genetic appearances with phenotyping. And we will end up very shortly, instead of talking about autism, we will start talking about autisms. And the first paper has been published based on the first 100 we did. We're now going to the next 1,000, and we're going to go to the next 10,000. This costs a lot of money to do this. It's not so much just the sequencing, but it's all of the computing power that's necessary to take the data and to do the analytics. So we need analytic money, we need computing power, and we need sequencing. But actually, we're making pretty good progress on that, and I hope that when we get down to December, Dr. Rob Ring is here sitting in front of me, is going to be giving us some public information as to about how we're moving forward on this topic with some partners. I think it's this is the only way we can really deal with personalized medicine. We don't offer drug companies anything. We offer them children with autism, and they're not going to spend the money. They're not going to go out and sequence all these kids. And then what are they going to do? They don't have the phenotyping material. They don't have that data down. They don't have any history. So we're going to try to provide all of that, break this down, and hopefully when we start showing up with packages of genetic materials and phenotyping matching up to certain appearances, that we'll end up with 6, 7, 8, or 9. I don't know how many different autisms, but I think that will change the scale and interest of a lot of drug companies, who will then say, we don't have a particular drug for autism, but we've had drugs that have worked in exactly the same appearance cycles as some of these situations you're bringing in. If that's the phenotyping, if we can rely on that phenotyping, then we can take to the next step to see if we can't stop the presentation of that or do something to control that particular presentation of autism. So very excited. That's not a near-term project, but that's a big one for us. Lastly, I want to mention adults. Adults with autism is something we're going to be working with. There's 500,000 children that will become adults within the next several years, and all of their medical educational things and support ends at the city, county, and state and federal level, as you all know. So they're going to be out there on their own. They can't really be on their own, so they're going to be with their parents. They're going to be struggling to find that. We're involved in that. We're going to release a big study that we've taken 2 years to do, and that's being released this month about what the situation is on housing for autism. Now, that's a lot of things. There's one thing I wanted to spend a few minutes with you on, but before I do that, I wanted to show you this film we did about some of the things that are going on with us. So if I could take a look at that, Michael, would be great.
Autism Speaks is an organization that was born out of complete heartbreak and grew out of complete commitment and the sheer force of will.
We had this bouncing little boy, had an extraordinary vocabulary. When he was in the car, he would say, "Oh, garbage truck, dump truck." It was just amazing. And then one day it just started to slip away.
When Christian, the first grandson of NBC Universal Chairman and CEO Bob Wright and his wife Suzanne, was diagnosed with autism in 2004, Bob and Suzanne, their daughter Katie and son-in-law Andreas, went through a period of mourning. And then they started asking questions.
We went around the country and we visited hospitals and we visited groups of people or families dealing with it, and we were shocked at how pervasive it was and how little help they were getting.
And so the questions led to more questions and transformed two new grandparents into revolutionaries, and shortly afterwards, visionaries.
We needed to be the voice of these children and these families that were struggling, millions of them, with this epidemic of autism. They're exhausted, they're broke. It's so unrelenting autism. There's no time to speak out. We needed to speak out for these children.
Where to start? Two of the most powerful people in the media began their communication with the world first by defining autism. And now it's widely understood as a complex whole-body developmental disorder with a variety of symptoms that include problems speaking, communicating, developing social relationships, learning and behaving appropriately, as well as gastrointestinal issues. From there, the 4 pillars of the Autism Speaks Foundation were laid: awareness, advocacy, family services, and science and research. In the area of science, more than $200 million have been donated to researchers all over the nation to better understand autism on every level, from the digestive system down to the cell, and even a person's gene sequence. The money raised comes from years of hard work. Nearly 200 full-time staffers and countless volunteers raise money at formal galas, auctions, golf outings, concerts, and walks every month of every year. But our awareness campaign does not stop there. Our Light It Up Blue initiative highlights our worldwide effort to make autism a household word on every corner of the planet. We started in New York with the United Nations and the passage of a resolution forever declaring April 2nd World Autism Awareness Day. And with that crowning achievement, an extraordinary global spotlight on the most pressing developmental disorder of our time. And we mean a spotlight. In 2013, more than 8,000 buildings, landmarks, businesses, and neighborhoods everywhere were bathed in blue light on all 7 continents and on the International Space Station. And now, because of Autism Speaks and the grandparents who founded it, the world can no longer turn a blind eye to autism. One nation at a time, leaders are standing up, stepping forward, and joining our fight. And not only are they listening, they are initiating change in their own countries. The ripple effect is well underway. We at Autism Speaks are their guide. And we are teaching them that awareness and advocacy go hand in hand. Here at home, we've increased autism awareness by more than 45%. But that's still not enough. We want 100% of the population to know the signs and symptoms of autism.
My neighbor's son has autism. My son has autism.
And so we've produced public service announcements to reach Latino and lower income communities where children tragically are being diagnosed later and not getting to doctors and therapists early enough. What we know definitively about autism is that the earlier a child gets to see a doctor and starts special education sessions, speech services, occupational and physical therapy, the better the outcome. But these services are expensive. And one state at a time, we are lobbying for and getting real insurance reform for our families. And now more than 2/3 of those states are covered. Our Family Services Division arms moms, dads, and siblings with what we call our toolkits, information they need for every bump in the road, from tantrums to potty training to seeing a doctor. Autism, though, is not just a kid's disorder. As our autism crisis ages around the world, it grows in depth.
In the United States, there's going to be 500,000 teenagers that are going to become adults in the next 10 years, and they lose all of their services.
We are working with big and small businesses to encourage them to employ adults affected by autism. We are helping families transition their children into adulthood. And we're not only asking the critical questions, but formulating a plan. Where will our children live? How will we support them?
This is generations of children that are being left behind. No country can afford to have 2% of its boys. That's not going to make it. We have to do something about it.
We at Autism Speaks see the tsunami. What was once 1 in 166 children diagnosed with autism is now 1 in 88 children. And for boys, it's 1 in 54. We recognize the cost to the families and the country, estimated at up to $2.3 million per person for their lifetime. That translates to well over $137 billion and does not account for new cases being diagnosed every 11 minutes. We understand there's 3 million people in America alone, 70 million worldwide who need us. Add their parents and caregivers, and the number becomes too much to bear. We are their voice. We are Autism Speaks.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to finish off with some comments. You know, so much of what we do is thinking about it from a 10,000-foot level, and that's fine. It has to be. You know, that's like business and science are organized, so you have to do that. But you know, this is a little bit of observations here that I think are noteworthy as you leave here later today or this evening about autism. We really do, as we do it now, see it's a whole body disorder. Years ago, it was odd behavior, mental disorder, managed largely in what we could call bad or odd behavior. We've seen the videos of the children spinning and rocking. And yes, we still see them spinning, and we still see them rocking, repeating words, rewinding videos, lining up toys, running in circles, having horrible meltdowns and outbursts. That hasn't ended. We put it in a category of mental illness or mental health because it looked to be outside of behavioral disorder. But now we know that there is one piece, that's only one piece of the puzzle. These children are oftentimes affected by a number of other physical problems. They can have low tone, they can have difficulties walking, climbing, even holding their body upright, which is so critical for breathing and for speech. They can have problems with fine motor skills. They can swipe an iPad like a champ, but when it comes to holding a pencil or a crayon and putting the right amount of pressure on it on a piece of paper, they can't do it. They can't write their letters or their name. They may never sign a document. We think that we have headaches. We think they have headaches, but remind us when they can't talk. So, you know, what do we really know? Why they're hitting themselves into walls? Is it out of pain or is it out of frustration? There are a few things that are more painful for a parent than to see their child intentionally smashing his or her head into a wall. Their digestive system is often a mess. This is no longer in question. Some children do not speak, not break down and digest food like you and I. Some get reflux and pain. It was almost 5 years ago, 6 years ago, Gary, that with Andy Conrad and a bunch of others, you sat down and helped put together a piece of paper with a bunch of pediatric gastroenterologists to acknowledge the fact that autism and it was that parents and children with autism, maybe up to 30%, have some gastro problem. And that was like pulling teeth to get that done. It was published as a paper from the American Academy, but nothing has really changed. And that one of our frustrations is, and I'm picking this here because there are many areas of autism that haven't changed, and this is one. Our children often suffer by chronic diarrhea and constipation. Imagine diarrhea every day, all day. At its worst, my grandson Christian had it 10 times a day. One of our staffers has a son who doesn't go to the bathroom for a week at a time. These are real issues that these people are dealing with. My daughter Katie is my harshest critic. Her view of what we do is, what have you done for me today? What have you done for Christian tomorrow? I don't want to talk about 10 years from now. I don't want to talk about 7 years. What have you done for us last week? And why haven't you used all these information that parents have? Why can't you break through? Why do you still get stuck with protocols that deny what parents see and observe every single day of the week? And that's the world I live in, and I don't ignore it because I get it everywhere I go. Many of our children are now adults, and they are still not toilet trained. Christian struggles with training at age of 12. Katie and her husband Andreas have never leave their house without knowing exactly where the next available bathroom is on their route. Many families carry multiple sets of clothes in case of accidents. Our children never outgrow baby wipes and diapers. These aren't pretty pictures, but they are real. They're real for a lot of people that have children with autism and children. They beg profound questions like, where's the food going if there's chronic diarrhea? How much is digested? How toxic is the child if he has chronic constipation? How much of the nutrients in their food is actually getting absorbed in the body? Are our children satiated and malnourished at the same time? Where in this mix do we fit the crazy food cravings like chocolate, but like chalk, dirt, and refined carbs? Some children will eat only one thing 3 times a day. Some parents spend the better part of their days shopping, preparing food, and trying to get their children to eat. But where's it going? Digestion, absorption, elimination. We all take it for granted, yet it's the root of where we are living as human beings, without which we really can't survive. So imagine being a parent with an adult child in diapers. And again, this is nothing easy about autism, and we haven't gotten to that yet. We have been involved in some work with gastrointestinal area. We're going to be looking to do a great deal more. It has been hard to get research. It's been hard to get the research. The world of the gut looks to be like the next frontier in the study of autism. With our assistance at the University of California, Davis, scientists are examining the relationships between gut bacteria, immune profiles, and cells lining the intestines. At Columbia, researchers are investigating fungi, viruses, inflammatory gene pathways. Paul Ashwood, Alessio Fasano, and their team found a clear link between immune function, GI problems, and regressive autism. The body of research is growing, but not nearly enough. I'm just saying this because we have to think very broadly. We have to think at 10,000 feet, and we have to think at the ground level. We have to put a human face on autism to get autism on the map. We've held conferences, World Health Organization in Geneva, I told you about. We've had a conference there a month and a half ago. They supported it. They paid for it. And it was extremely well attended by a large number of countries around the world. Suzanne has done first ladies and dignitaries in New York for a number of years. And we had 30 of them at the opening in the United Nations General Assembly. I mentioned the First Lady of Panama is doing this program down in Panama. That's all down there at the ground level. So we need to get our research aligned to understand the needs of these people as well, and to see if we can't use more information that is available. Their pain is now. It took Katie years to find a doctor who could actually deal with Christian's problems as being a problem, serious GI problems interfaced with his other behavioral problems. So, but let's acknowledge the parents. These parents have had their laser-like observational skills since the child's diagnosis. Katie knows more about Christian and his autism than probably any of the doctors I've met. But our parents are stretched very thin in every way. It's hard for them to operate financially, physically, and emotionally. In all honesty, a lot of them are just existing, surviving their days, not thriving, not really living. Remember these things if you have them in your company, if you have them in your labs, or you're designing a study for them. You know, on the issue of gut, that's the foundation of our health. It's not new. Concerns over nourishing bodies and digesting properly did not pop up yesterday. You can find them throughout the history of man. There are many examples now popping up of doctors, even doctors dealing with adults, where they're now going to check guts when they come in with a lot of disturbing activity and a lot of disorganized activity, and they're finding that that sometimes is often where the problem begins, not where it ends. So I just leave you with this as we embark here at the Bloomberg School of Public Health and here at the Wendy Klag Center for Autism and Developmental Disabilities. Please do everything we can to use the observational information you have along with all the science and recognize that down at the ground levels, despite the progress we've made, it's not a pleasant picture. So when you go back to your classrooms, offices, and labs, you know, don't forget that there are 70 million people around the world suffering from autism, supported whether they be in Africa or Siberia. We have not found any way to distinguish prevalence rates from one country to another. The absolute best study that's been done to date was in Seoul, Korea, and Andy Shih was directly involved in that. There's a group of researchers. I don't know if any of them were here. I easily could have been, but they represented 3 universities and outside and Koreans as well. That's the golden test, because they did the epidemiology based upon the school records, based upon medical records available, but then they had a program. It took 2.5 more years where they sent out information to parents at request of several parents to indicate whether their children were having problems in school, and they went through an enormous exercise with the school board cooperating, and they ended up with another 1.5% of the population on top of the 1% that they'd already gotten through the record. So they got 2.5%. That's the study that I think we'll see in the United States. That's a study that's going to come out of the ADAM program in South Carolina, I'll predict. The Center for Disease Control has already indicated their next level is going to be 1 in 50. So from their own material. Anyway, there's a lot of things riding on this, a lot of good work, and a lot of things in front of us. So I just want to say how proud that I am that I could be here to represent the people that we represent, and to be with you and to be in this wonderful school with this extraordinary history and so many talented people. And my friend, Dean Michael, thank you very, very much for the honor. Please.
Thank you so much to you and your whole family for what was really an inspiring presentation of where we've come and how much more there is to do. I really appreciate all of that. And now I would like to turn the microphone over to Lisa Croen. Lisa is with Kaiser Permanente's Division of Research. She is a senior research scientist at Kaiser and also the head of their autism research program. And she's a close colleague of mine in some of the epidemiology of autism that we do in this country, including the some of the CDC work just mentioned, as well as many others in the room, and is really a world-renowned epidemiologist. And so we've asked her to come and give us a little bit more about the epidemiology of autism in the state today. So welcome, Lisa.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a real honor to be here at the inaugural symposium for the Wendy Klag Center for Autism and Developmental Disabilities. I congratulate all of you at Hopkins and Danny for your new directorship of the center. I'm sure under your leadership it will grow and prosper, and we'll all discover many new insights into autism, which are very needed. Let's see if I can get my slides here. Going. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to take a rather high-level approach to talking about the epidemiology of autism. And Danny asked me specifically to talk about what we know about genetics and environmental risk factors, which is, I think, really the foundation of autism. Without understanding what's causing autism, it's very difficult to come up with effective interventions and treatments, and have an understanding of where we're going forward with this all too common set of disorders. So I'm going to give a rather high-level overview of what we know, where we've come from, and where I think we may be going. So as I think you all are probably aware, autism was first described here at Johns Hopkins by Lee O'Connor, a child psychiatrist who was at the Johns Hopkins Medical School. And his first description of autism came out in print in 1943. So now here we are in 2013. That's 70 years ago. That's only 70 years ago. Unlike other conditions which research has been going on for years and years, like cancer and diabetes and other kinds of chronic conditions, autism has not been well known, at least in the public, and even had a name for very long. And so the research into the causes of autism have also really haven't been around that long, and we've only had a 50 or 60 year history of doing research into this set of disorders. And what I'd like to sort of impart in this talk by the end is where we've come, what our understanding was in terms of cause of autism from the very beginning, from in the early 1940s when Lee O'Connor first described this set of conditions, to now, how we approach the thinking behind what is causing autism, and how genetics, both genetics and environmental factors, are considered to be very key in understanding the causes of autism. So in fact, in that landmark paper by Connor in 1943, which he called Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact, he had a couple of very interesting observations. Firstly, after a very eloquent description of 11 patients of his who had autism, who all shared some similar characteristics, many of which you've just heard about from our previous speaker, he made a couple of key observations, one of which was he said that there were very few really warm-hearted fathers and mothers in this group of parents. But he also said that the children's aloneness was apparent from the very beginning of life, and it makes it difficult to attribute the whole picture to the type of early parental relations with the children. So his sort of fundamental conclusion at the end of this paper was that we must assume that these children have come into the world with innate inability to form the usual effective contact with people. So as you can see from this paper, there was sort of a battle here from the very beginning between nature and nurture. And unfortunately, I think for the next 20 years or so of autism being around, there was a strong, dominant, prevailing attitude about autism and belief about autism that the cause was because of this lack of effective parenting, lack of closeness in a parenting style. This really caused a lot of problems and a lot of difficulties for parents. And finally, in the early 60s, this is 20 years after autism was first described, Bernard Rimland wrote a paper that established and stated very clearly that there was in fact a biological basis for this disorder. And so since then, there has been a growing amount of research looking for that biological basis. Since the 1960s, from the 1960s to really for the next 30 or 40 years, the predominant kind of research that was done was focusing on genetics. What is the genetic underpinning of autism? And really, to a large degree, to the exclusion of looking for non-genetic factors. Now, in the early 2000s, there was more and more attention paid to the environment. The genetics discoveries were growing, but there wasn't any particular gene that could be identified as being a cause of autism or a particular mechanism, but lots of different genetic discoveries were being made. But a growing body of evidence, starting slowly with some studies that were looking at non-genetic factors, factors during the prenatal period, factors around the early life of children, identifying factors that were associated with increased risk for autism that were not genetic factors. So I think finally, not too long ago, in the last 10 years or so ago, there's been a real fundamental shift in thinking about what is the underlying cause of autism. And now we have an understanding that both genetics and environment play a role. So to step back just a little bit, what are the core features of autism spectrum disorders? Well, we've just undergone a big shift from the DSM-4 criteria, diagnostic criteria, to the DSM-5. And according to the DSM-5 criteria, there are two main domains that are affected. These include deficits in social communication and social interaction, and also patterns of restricted and repetitive behaviors, interests, and activities. And interestingly, included now in the DSM-5, you have the ability to come up with diagnostic specifiers, or to specify certain aspects of the disorder in terms of severity, language development, and so on, including noting associated known medical or genetic conditions or environmental factors, or this should be an and environmental factors. So in the diagnostic criteria of the DSM-5, autism is based on the social impairments and social communication impairments and these particular patterns of behaviors, but also you can specify what other genetic and environmental factors might be going on. And so I think this is pretty interesting and salient in that, again, there's a focus not only on genetic factors, but also on environmental factors. So autism is really considered, some people talk about the autisms, and this is a drawing I included that was done by my nephew, who's an autistic young man now. He's 28 years old. I asked him to draw me a picture of his animals that he's been drawing since he was 8 years old. This was about 4 years ago. I asked him to draw me a picture, and he woke up one morning and he was busy drawing, and he said, "I'm drawing 77 animals," and he had to go from number 1 to number 77 before we could do something else that day. And I include this as a really nice illustration of the autisms. We recognize that these are all animals. They're all very playful, happy animals, yet each one is completely distinct and individual. And so this is really what the autisms are. There's a very wide expression of severity, from mild to severe, different types of comorbidities that are associated in different individuals. The behavioral manifestations and the physical manifestations are really unique in each individual. And yet, it's a spectrum that does hang together in some ways. And the challenge here is finding the causes of these disorders that are so heterogeneous. So what do we know about the prevalence? You've heard already today that the prevalence currently is 1 in 88. There's been a dramatic increase in the number of individuals being diagnosed with autism ever since it was described. The first epidemiologic survey was done in 1966, and in that survey, the prevalence was noted to be 4 or 5 per 10,000. So in those years, in the 40 or 50 years since then, we've seen this dramatic increase, and this graph really demonstrates that the increase in prevalence, and the different colors and shapes represent the different diagnostic criteria that have been used over time. And that is one one of the things that has changed over time, one of many, what we consider autism or autism spectrum disorders has really been defined. The definition has changed and evolved over time, and maybe partly driving this dramatic increase in prevalence, at least in numbers of individuals that are given that diagnosis. But clearly, that's not the only explanation. And what we don't really know is what are the factors that are motivating this or driving this incredible increase in prevalence and likely continued increase as we continue to count. So this is another way of showing you that graph. Prior to 1990, 1 in 2,000 children was considered to have autism. And today, we've had this steady increase over the decades, and the most recent estimates from the CDC, as you heard from Bob Wright, is 1 in 88 children. So in terms of etiology, what do we know? Well, as I mentioned, there was many years of research that was done pretty much exclusively on genetics, looking for the underpinnings of autism, and many different kinds of study designs and different laboratories and different investigators looking at this from different angles. What we do know is that there's a very strong genetic underpinning for autism, and we know this from different lines of research. From family studies, the most recent estimates show that the recurrence risk among siblings is approaching 20%. This was data that was published a few years ago by the Baby SIBS Consortium, where they're studying the younger siblings of children with autism and have watched them very closely over time from the age of 6 months or until the early toddlerhood, and do rigorous diagnostic assessments, standardized assessments, and found this remarkable 18.7% of the baby SIBS were diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder at around the age of 3. We also know that about genetics from strong heritability from twin studies, which have looked at the concordance of autism among twins, among both monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins, and have found incredibly high concordance among the genetically identical twin pairs, the monozygotic twin pairs, and a lower concordance in the dizygotic twin pairs, suggesting a strong genetic underpinning. We also know that there is a broader autism phenotype in some family members of affected individuals where there may be autistic symptoms. In the family members, they may not meet full diagnostic criteria, but have some of the phenotypic features of autism. And there are a host of other genetic findings that have discovered genes or candidate genes for autism, genetic syndromes, chromosomal anomalies, and de novo and inherited copy number variation, all associated with autism, suggesting a very strong genetic underpinning. So the current thinking in terms of genetics is, yes, it's really there, it's very important, but there's very extensive genetic heterogeneity, and both common and rare variation exist in multiple genes and genes that have diverse functions. So these are genes that affect immune function, metabolism, xenobiotic metabolism, and all different kinds of genes that affect brain, neural cell growth and function, and so forth and so on. But genetics is just one piece of the puzzle. There's also been a growing body of evidence from different kinds of studies, again, different study designs done in this country and elsewhere, looking at non-genetic factors. One of the earliest observations and the most consistent observations that we've seen in the epidemiology of autism is this significant male preponderance. So there's a male-female ratio of somewhere between 4 and 1. Some estimates say 2 to 3 males per every 1 female, or up to 5 or 6 males for every female, depending on how you define autism. But this is a very consistent finding across all studies, and the reasons for this are really not well understood. I was speaking with John Constantino earlier today about this, who just attended a symposium that was hosted by the Simons Foundation, and there really are no really good explanations for why males are so much more at risk for autism spectrum disorders than females. So this is an area, this is a very strong hint, but we haven't been able to yet understand what is underlying this. There's some different theories, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this area. Another fairly consistent finding in terms of sociodemographic factors is this finding that older parents seem to have a higher risk for having children with autism spectrum disorders. And this is older mothers as well as older fathers. There's some controversy in the scientific community about if there's more of an effect with older mothers than with older fathers, but I think there's pretty much consensus now that both the age of both parents is important. And again, what that represents, we don't really know. We don't know what that means, but there are different theories looking at that and having to do with de novo mutations, so some genetic mutations that may occur more often as parents age, increased exposures and exposure burdens in mothers, and hormonal effects, endocrine effects in mothers as they age. But we don't really understand the mechanisms yet. There are differences in across studies in terms of what kind of race ethnic profile there is in autism. We know that autism affects people from every racial group and every ethnicity, but depending on the studies and how they're done, we see different rates in different groups. But I think, and again, what's underlying these different rates is unclear. If it's biological explanations, access to services, different cultural practices that may drive parents to seek medical attention and diagnoses for their children or not. So there's a lot wrapped up in these different sociodemographic factors that may explain what is going on. In Connor's initial publication, he talked about the high degree of education of the parents, and that I think in just about all of those 11 families, the mothers and fathers were very well educated. Many had higher degrees and were working in professional occupations, and so this finding of higher education has been has been replicated in some populations, but not in all. And again, it may have to do with access to services and administrative differences rather than something biological this is a surrogate for, but we're not really sure about that either. So in terms of what we traditionally think of as environmental exposures, and I'm using environment here broadly, basically non-genetic, there have been a whole slew of findings having to do with prenatal exposures. So these are exposures, the in utero exposures, largely driven by activities or medical situations of the mother. Many different medications have been associated with autism, with increasing risk: thalidomide, valproic acid, misoprostol, and most recently SSRIs. These findings, the SSRI finding has been replicated now once, and in a large population in Sweden, and other studies are looking at this. And this is an interesting finding because for a long time there's been finding of in families of increased of the role of serotonin and serotonin-related genes in autism. So what this means, and if this is really a modifiable risk factor, remains to be seen. We need a lot more research on this, but it's a very intriguing finding. From very early on, maternal infections have been associated with increasing risk for autism in some children. And based on some very early work looking at rubella, people who were exposed congenitally to congenital rubella who had a much higher rate of autism than you would expect, and other viral infections, cytomegalovirus and others, have been associated. More recently, there's research suggesting that bacterial infections in moms, especially towards the end of pregnancy, might be related to increased risk. But there's not a lot of consistency in these findings, and much more work to be done. And the idea may be that it's maternal immune function rather than the infectious agent itself that might be the mediating factor in affecting the developing brain. There's many different chemicals that have been hypothesized to be related to increasing risk for autism. Not much research yet has been done on these, but some is emerging, and also not a lot of consistency. But many of these chemicals have neurotoxicity properties, are neurotoxic, and also immunotoxic. So there's some biologic plausibility for looking at these different kinds of chemical exposures. Many different metabolic and endocrine and immune conditions in mom and in family members have been associated with autism. Obstetric complications have, of many kinds, increased C-section rates, breech delivery, low APGAR scores, preterm birth. Many different factors during the pregnancy and delivery have been associated, and sometimes quite consistently. But again, are these causal factors? Are they associated with the outcome? It's possible that the dysregulated brain development may actually be the predisposing factor for some of these obstetric complications. So the direction of the causal arrow still remains to be determined. Many other hypotheses about maternal stress, diet, vitamins, infertility treatments, all of which require further study, and none of which have much evidence yet behind them. So there's a lot of work to do in this arena, but I think it's clear from the evidence that has emerged there is an environmental component to autism, and perhaps that the increase in the observed prevalence may be linked to changes in the environment. So clearly, both genes and environment are important. It's a combination of genetic and environmental factors. Occurring during critical windows of exposure, critical windows of development. Clearly, the gestational period is important. There are some studies now looking at preconception exposures and even looking at exposures to grandparents and how grandparental exposures may trickle down to affecting the third generation, to the grandchildren. And it's likely that there are many different factors operating in different kinds of combinations that predict autism or create an increased risk for autism, and different clinical subgroups likely have different risk profiles. So sort of a quick conceptual model of autism etiology. Environmental factors are important, genetic factors, all either acting on each other or through more endogenous systems, the immune system, endocrine, metabolic, and epigenetic, all affecting this complex outcome we call autism spectrum disorder. How much is due to the environment and how much is due to genetics? There was a paper a couple years ago that came out in 2011 that was led by Joachim Hallmeyer from Stanford, looking at the genetic heritability and the shared environment and trying to tease these apart. This was a large twin study that was done in California, and the conclusions from that study found that genetic factors explain substantially less of the causes of autism than we previously thought. The estimate was about 38%, and that environmental factors explain substantially more than was previously thought, and the liability to autism from environmental factors was estimated to be about 58%. And what this paper demonstrated was that both prenatal and early postnatal environment should be the focus of future research, along with looking at genetics and genetic factors. So there's been increasing interest in the gene-environment interactions and risk for autism, and a whole relatively new field of epigenetics as well, which simply stated is looking at chemical modifications of genes other than changes in the DNA sequence itself that control the expression of the genes. So, and this is a mechanism that is thought to possibly link environment with genetics, and in terms of causing increasing risk for disease. And there's a whole body of literature now that documents epigenetic changes that have been linked to environmental exposures. Well, the missing piece here is that there's not a whole lot of evidence yet to link these epigenetic changes to certain diseases, and certainly not to autism, but there's a growing body of work that's looking at that. So this is a slide that shows the different causal mechanisms, different ways that genes and environment could interact. And you can see here that the environment could create damage, could create genetic damage, and that genetic point mutations or structural damage to the genome could then go on to increase risk for autism. You could have the environment working on through these epigenetic changes, so changing the gene expression. And conversely, you could have underlying genetics that could influence the kinds of environments that people are exposed to, and that could lead directly to the adverse outcomes. And lastly, you could have classic, what we consider gene by environment interaction, where it takes both the genetic susceptibility in the presence of an environmental exposure and the combination to create the increased risk. So I'm going to just, in the last few minutes, talk about a few studies that I'm involved with Danny Fallon, looking at a couple of these mechanisms. One is the study to explore early development, which is a large multi-site study, epidemiologic study being done in 6 different places around the country. This is funded by the Centers for Disease Control. And in addition to the goal of trying to characterize autism, the behavioral phenotype, and looking at associated developmental and medical and behavioral conditions, we are investigating genetic and environmental risk factors across a variety of domains. And we're doing this by collecting biospecimens from mothers and affected children and fathers, doing comprehensive phenotyping of the children, and also collecting information on a variety of exposures and prenatal environmental conditions through direct maternal interviews and looking at medical records and so on. And Danny is heading up a study that's looking genome-wide at genome-wide interaction with the environment, and using the SNP data, GWAS SNP data, to identify genes whose effects on risk may vary across a variety of exposures. So this is knowing what the exposures are from pregnancy and looking to see what genes might be associated with autism through the lens of these different kinds of prenatal environmental exposures. Another study is another large national study called the EARLY Study, which is a prospective cohort study starting with pregnancies of women who already have one affected child, and watching very closely through the pregnancy period and the early development of the newborn sibling to see what factors, both genetic and environmental factors, may predict autism in that baby sib. We're focusing very heavily on the prenatal period. And in terms of factors that are happening in that critical period of neurodevelopment. And this study is measuring the epigenome from in the mothers over time throughout pregnancy, in the newborns, and also looking at paternal cells from fathers, and looking at epigenetic factors and linking that with the environmental factors, the phenotype, and the genotype. So this is a very complex way of bringing together all the different domains to try to understand the complex etiology of autism spectrum disorders. So the future of autism etiologic research really, I think, is it has to rely on this genetic and environmental interplay, searching for environmental risk factors based on the clues that we have from autism genes and pathways, and conversely searching for genes and pathways based on environmental risk factors. And if we take this more systems-based approach, systems biology and pathway-based approaches using sophisticated bioinformatic tools to integrate all of this complex information from both the genetic world and the environmental world and toxicology, and mixing in multidisciplinary collaborations between all these different kinds of scientists, I think we have the opportunity to really increase the speed at which we lead to discovery of risk factors and ultimately find modifiable factors that will lead to better interventions and prevention of this of a lot of the disability that's associated with autism spectrum disorder. So I think now with this new center, the Wendy Klag Center for Autism and Developmental Disabilities, which has as one of its goals to bring together these multidisciplinary collaborations across the university and across the community, the center is really poised to make an important contribution to the etiology, to understanding the etiology of autism. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lisa. We have this organized into 3 or 4 talks before, and then a break, and then some talks after. And I think what we'll do to keep the flow going is invite you to sort of come and go if you need to take a biological break, but hold your questions until after Dr. Mandell, which will be the last of this first half of the session, and then we can ask of all 3 of them simultaneously. Okay? And so with that, I'm very happy to introduce Jennifer Mulle, who is an assistant professor at Emory. She's also an alumna of this department and of the School of Medicine here at Hopkins. And she's affiliated with both epidemiology at Emory as well as genetics. And have I left out other departmental affiliations? And Jen will bring back together some of the conversations that we've had via multiple speakers so far. Let me look for you.
Yeah, right there. Is there a pointer?
Right here.
Oh, beautiful.
And that should work, and it'll also advance if you prefer to advance that way.
Okay, awesome. So I just want to say how excited and honored and humbled I am to be here today. Today, you and I are going to have some fun. We're going to talk about the microbiome. We're going to talk about the gut microbiome. You're going to be totally grossed out by the end of it. If I've done my job, that'll be true. Then we're going to talk about the ways that the gut microbiome contributes to disease, and we're going to talk specifically about some of the primary data that seems to link changes in the gut microbiome to changes in behavior and possibly even neurodevelopment. And what I'd like to do today is just advance the gut microbiome as sort of a candidate that is worthy of study in risk for autism and worthy of sort of serious and respectful study, let's put it that way. And I'll come back to what I mean by that at the end. So just so we're all on the same page, let's talk about what the microbiome is. The word microbiome, I think, was actually coined by Dr. Joshua Lederberg. And so we're going to define that as the totality of microbes, their genomes, and their environmental interactions in a defined environment, such as the human genome, the human gut. The human microbiome has upwards of 100 trillion cells. If you think of me as a collection of cells up here talking to you, and if we define a cell by the DNA that it contains, only about 10% of the cells talking to you now are actually human. 90% of the cells associated with this body are actually microbial, which, yuck. And also, if we compared my human genome to my microbiome, there are actually 27 times more genes in my microbiome than in my human genome. So once upon a time, how did we study the microbiome? We did culture-based methods. Culture-based methods are great. You can get a lot of information about a specific microorganism, what it grows in, what it doesn't grow in, how fast it grows, whether it has antimicrobial resistance genes. The problem with culture methods is that many species just can't be cultured. And so we actually, up until recently, had no idea what was in our microbiome. And then in about 1985, culture-independent methods, DNA-based methods became available, and so these are actually really cool. It turns out that most microorganisms have a 16S ribosomal RNA gene, and that's comprised of some conserved elements, which are sort of common to all 16S genes, interspersed with variable regions, and those variable regions are different between species. And so what you can actually do is drop PCR primers down into those conserved elements, PCR across the variable regions sequence, and then you have kind of a barcode that tells you what's in there. And when we started using these DNA-based methods, we actually found a whole ton of stuff that we didn't know even existed living on us and in us because we had relied on culture-based methods for so long. And now there's the advent of next generation sequencing. And so when DNA-based methods were initially invented, you had to kind of separate out. So you had to do that PCR, separate out a single molecule, and then take it and Sanger sequence it. But now we don't need to do that. Actually, we can take an entire population of 16S amplicons and just throw them on a sequencer and ask what's in there. And so you can get information about the entire distribution, both qualitative and quantitative, about the type of species that exist anywhere, really. And in fact, you don't even need to do the 16S RNA step. You can just take everything that's in there, prepare a shotgun library, throw it on the sequencer, and then you don't actually get species level information. Instead, what you get is you sort of assemble the reads that you get into genes, and then you get a description of the kind of functional units that exist. And so I'll just show you an example of that data. So on the left, sorry. On the right, there's an example of 16S RNA sequencing. And so that inset graph is the distribution of phyla in this particular microorganism. And then the larger panel, actually, you can get down to genus level. And so this sort of answers the question, what microbes are present? And then with metagenomic sequencing, which is on the other side, the left, I think, you actually get something very different. You get a description of the functional units, the kind of genes that exist in this given population, that transcriptional potential. And so this answers the question, what are the microbes doing? And so with the advent of these of new technologies and this proliferation of data, two consortia were formed, one in Europe called the MetaHit Consortium, which was really devoted to understanding the microbiome of the human intestinal tract. And it was really focused on phenotypes, specifically obesity and inflammatory bowel disease. And then the Human Microbiome Project, funded by the NIH, the goal of that was to just understand the human microbiome in healthy humans. And so it turns out, I told you we're lousy, we're kind of teeming with bugs, but there are probably about 5 major microbiome communities. And that includes sort of the skin, the airway, the oral cavity, the gut, and then the urogenital tract. And so the Human Microbiome Project actually sought healthy human volunteers and sampled the microbiome from these 5 different places. And they actually sampled, for example, in the oral cavity, a couple different places, and so on. And did both 16S RNA and full metagenomic sequencing in a large population of individuals. And the other really nice thing is that there were standardized protocols about sample collection and about how to do the PCR and how to do the sequencing. And there was this explosion. The data are all publicly available, and now there's this explosion of bioinformatics tools. And these consortia have actually provided a huge wealth of data. And so this is an example of the data. And so this is all of the data. This is a principal components plot just describing what exists. And so for every individual, there are at least 5 different data points. And you can see that the data don't actually cluster by individual, they cluster by site. And so skin clusters with skin, gastrointestinal clusters with gastrointestinal. And so what that means is that if we took my skin and your skin and we sequenced the microbiome communities, they'd actually much more alike than would my skin and my gut. And that makes a lot of sense. The skin is a particular type of environment. It supports the growth of a certain type of microbe, and the gut is a very different environment. But the other thing I see when I look at this graph is I see a lot of variation. So even in the oral microbiome, for example, and as soon as I see variation, I think, oh, I wonder if that's related systematically in some way to disease susceptibility. And a lot of those studies have been done, and now there are relationships between the microbiome and disease. And so some of these aren't surprising, like the fact that the oral microbiome might be related to periodontal disease, but some are actually very surprising, that the oral microbiome, for example, might be related to preterm birth or to adverse pregnancy outcomes. And there's some actually very interesting and sort of wild data right now to suggest that maybe the placenta has a microbiome. And some data from mouse studies suggest that the placental microbiome actually may share some characteristics most in common with the oral microbiome, instead of, as you'd expect, maybe the gastrointestinal or the urogenital tract. And so there's actually a confluence of evidence here, because also periodontal disease has possibly been associated with preterm birth. And so this is sort of a really nice confluence of evidence. And what's really exciting is that there's translational potential here. You can probably alter the gut microbiome pretty easily, and maybe you can alter rates of preterm birth. The other thing I'll say about this slide is that the gut microbiome and obesity, so people have done metagenomic sequencing of the microbiome from obese individuals and lean individuals, and it turns out that exactly as you'd expect, the gut microbiome of obese individuals is enriched for genes related to energy harvest and nutrient digestion. And so again, this is a really beautiful kind of confluence of evidence, and it suggests translational potential because you might be able to alter the composition of the gut microbiome. So when I think about how the microbiome might be contributing to disease, I think there are probably two major ways. And so one is probably going up inflammatory pathways, and these are almost certainly mediated by host genetics. And these can be caused by a specific pathogen or by a community imbalance or by the entire community membership. And so one example of a specific pathogen that might cause disease is, of course, the very famous case of H. pylori causing peptic ulcers. And when I think about community membership causing disease, I think about inflammatory bowel disease, which is probably sort of a dysregulation of the entire environment. On the other side, the way that the gut microbiome or any microbiome could be contributing to disease is not the presence of the bacteria per se, but some kind of product or toxin or metabolite that's produced by the microbes that are present. And so an example of a single pathogen that contributes to that would be botulism. The presence of the botulism bacteria actually, it doesn't affect you at all. It's that toxin that it produces that is so detrimental. And then community membership creating a set of metabolites that contributes to disease. I think of the really exciting work that's coming out of Cleveland Clinic, Stan Hazen's group, where they've shown that there's a real difference in trimethylamine metabolism. So steak eaters have a specific type of microbiome, and they release lots of trimethylamines, and it's those trimethylamines which are really the risk factor for heart disease. And vegans don't actually make any kind of trimethylamine. Even if you feed them a steak, they don't make any trimethylamine. And so really that's related to the community that sort of has colonized your gut, which is probably related to long-term dietary influences. And so how the microbiome might be contributing to behavior and possibly even neurodevelopment, it could be through one of these mechanisms, or it could be through a new mechanism that we haven't quite understood yet. So let's talk about the gut microbiome. The gut microbiome is the largest, most complex, and richest community of microorganisms that we harbor. This graph right here just shows the dramatic changes in pH as you go from the stomach to the colon, and there's a commensurate increase in microbial biomass as you travel that route as well. So how do we get a gut microbiome? Well, infants are born sterile or approximately sterile. There's some debate about whether there's anything present in the meconium, but we're probably about sterile. And then immediately upon birth, infants are inoculated by their maternal microbiome. And so, of course, the way that you're born greatly influences what you're inoculated by. And then shortly after birth, you're inoculated and then you're colonized. And we know that the gut is colonized because shortly after birth, infants have increasing presence of microbial species in their stool. What you're fed strongly influences the composition of your gut microbiome. Of course, breastfed infants have very different microbial composition in their guts than do formula-fed infants. And among very low birth weight preterm infants, it's been shown that the gut microbiome, the diversity of the gut microbiome correlates with digestive tolerance and weight gain. And so again, this is great translational opportunity, especially in vulnerable populations. So during infancy, the gut microbiome, it's very chaotic. It's sort of susceptible to lots of forces, and we're going to talk about some of that primary data in just a second. But then by the time you're an adult, your gut microbiome probably settles down and approximately becomes quite stable. And so it's funny that I use this as an example of an adult, but I'm not sure there is an adult in this picture. So this is the early gut microbiome. So this study is actually, there was a single infant and its gut microbiome was sampled repeatedly, and it was subject to 16S sequencing. And this is a distribution of the phyla that are present in the gut microbiome of that infant. And so you can see that there's very little diversity. There's a few things kind of hopping around. But right here, when this baby was about 3 months old, it got a fever. And you can see that there is a dramatic effect of that fever on the gut microbiome. Things really change. And then the baby started table foods, and the gut microbiome changed some more. And then when the baby was about a year old, it had a course of antibiotics. And you can see that the diversity of the gut microbiome wiped right out by those antibiotics. And And this is just a single infant, but here are a collection of infants from 0 to 3 years of age, and the dots just represent where they are from, the United States or Venezuela or Malawi. But you can see that even in a collection of infants, as the children get older, the diversity of their microbiome increases. And so what I think is particularly interesting about this is that this early period where the gut microbiome is really subject to a lot of forces, we know that that's a critical period where a circuitry relevant to autism is being established. So these are some determinants of the gut microbiome. This is the same principal components graph, just colored by sort of different variables. So age clearly affects your gut microbiome. Where you're from affects your gut microbiome. The United States gut microbiome is very different from Venezuela or Malawi. These are, the gray dots are adults, and these dots are formula-fed or breastfed infants, and you can see there's a big difference, and I'm sort of laughing that all the formula-fed infants are from the United States. And finally, gender. Gender doesn't really seem to have any effect on the gut microbiome. So I think there's this weird paradox of the gut microbiome. I mean, here we are at a school of public health. We're constantly washing our hands. We cook our meat to death. Probably no one in the room has eaten egg salad in a decade. And so we're really kind of focused on keeping microbes out, and yet we allow this whole colony, 100 trillion cells, to live within us. And so why do we do that? And so it's been proposed that the gut microbiome must have some function. And so that function could be, it's been called our forgotten organ, or our second genome. And so that function could just be passive. It could be that it's too big a space to defend. And so rather than try to keep everybody out, you let benign things live and take up all the nutrients and take up all the space, and then nothing pathogenic. There's no room or resources left for pathogenic things to take hold. Another possibility is that the gut microbiome probably educates the immune system. So there's not actually immunologic tolerance in the gut. The gut is a very immune cell rich sort of environment, and I almost think of it as like a prison camp. So there's this low level of inflammation. It's sometimes called physiologic inflammation or controlled inflammation. And I feel like the microbiomes, I mean the microbes are kind of allowed to live and work and survive in this environment, but they're kind of patrolled by all these guards. And if there's a breach, there's like Armageddon ready to rain down on that invader. Certainly the function of the gut microbiome is metabolic for nutrient harvest and energy digestion. I told you that there are 27 times more genes in the gut microbiome than there are in our own microbiome. So those are all those metabolic pathways that I don't actually have to code, that can be coded for me, and then I can just use the metabolic endpoints from those pathways. And finally, there's some data to suggest that the gut microbiome is involved in neuronal development, possibly by modulation of the gut-brain axis and motor control and behavior. And that's the data that we're going to talk about next. So these experiments have been done in germ-free mice. So germ-free mice actually have absolutely no microbiome. They are raised in completely sterile conditions. And they have some really weird properties. I mean, they survive and they do okay, but they have, for example, as you'd expect, kind of a sluggish immune system and some other things, but I'm going to talk about their behavior right now. So this is just a light-dark test, and mice should like to stay in the dark because it keeps them safe, but in fact, germ-free mice tend to spend a lot more time in the light. And germ-free mice actually have increased turnover of monoamine neurotransmitters in the striatum, including noradrenaline, dopamine, and serotonin. And so right away, we see that if you don't have a gut microbiome, you have altered neurochemistry and altered behavior. So now in this experiment, the germ-free mice and conventional mice who have a microbiome were stressed. So the mice are restrained for about an hour. This is very stressful. And then hormones related to stress are measured. And in fact, germ-free mice have an exacerbated anxiety response. And so then these investigators took these mice, germ-free mice, and gave them a gut microbiome at either 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and then tested them again at 9 weeks. And they measured their stress hormones at this level right here, this 1 hour time point, right after the stress is alleviated. And so the 6 week mice who got a microbiome at 6 weeks are indicated by these heavy bars. And you can see that if you get a gut microbiome at 6 weeks, it partially alleviates that stress response. But if you get a gut microbiome at 8 weeks, it doesn't actually alleviate the stress response. And so this introduces the idea of temporality, that it not just matters that you have a gut microbiome, it matters when you get it. And this graph down here is just showing, again, altered neurochemistry, that germ-free mice have lower NMDA receptor subunits and lower BDNF protein. Okay, so now of all the things that I'm going to tell you about today, this is actually my favorite. So this is a step-down latency test. So this is, you put mice on a platform, and then you measure how long it takes them to step down. And so mice that are really brave step right off the platform. Mice that are really shy stay on the platform for a long time. And so in this experiment, the mice stayed on the platform for this amount of time, almost 3 minutes, and then they were given for 7 days an oral antibiotic. And so that really kind of wiped out their entire microbiome. And when they have no microbiome, these mice now suddenly become very brave. They step right off that platform. And then when their gut is allowed to recolonize, they stay on the platform, so their behavior reverts. So it seems like there's a behavioral change when you take away that microbiome in the very same mice. And again, when these mice are administered an oral antimicrobial, the pattern of expression of BDNF changes quite dramatically. Okay, now in this experiment, these are NIH Swiss mice, and these are BALB-C mice. So NIH Swiss mice are very brave. They step right off the platform. And BALB-C mice are very shy. They stay on the platform. So these investigators took NIH Swiss mice who were germ-free. They had never seen a microbiome. And they gave them an NIH Swiss mice microbiome, and they behaved like NIH Swiss mice. They stepped right off the platform. They then gave them a BALB-C microbiome, and those mice behaved like BALB-C mice. So they're genetically NIH Swiss mice. They have a BALB-C mouse microbiome, and they behave like BALB-C mice. They stay on the platform for much longer. And the reverse is actually true for BALB-C mice. If you give BALB-C mice an NIH Swiss microbiome, they suddenly become very brave. And so this experiment to me is so extraordinary because it seems like the investigators have transplanted the behavior along with the gut microbiome. Probiotics, let's talk about probiotics for a second. It seems like probiotics affect behavior. So these are 3 examples of stress tests, and mice were either given conventional food or conventional food that's enhanced with a very specific probiotic, a very specific strain of lactobacillus. And so this is just a stress-induced hyperthermia test in panel A, and I think and their temperature doesn't change, but in an open arm maze, mice that are fed probiotics are actually much more exploratory. And in a forced swim test, so mice don't like to swim, and so sometimes they just give up and they wait to drown. But actually, if they're fed probiotics, they actually swim a lot more. They're sort of a little more active. They fight for survival a little more. So in panel B, mice are given, these poor mice, they're put in a cage, and then they get a tone and a light and a shock. And so by the end of this experiment, this is just the first trial, and no matter what they're fed, all of the mice figure out that they're going to get a shock, and they all freeze when they hear the tone and see the light. On day 2, there's no shock. They just get a light and a tone, and you measure how many mice freeze. Do they remember that they got this shock? And it seems like mice who are fed probiotics tend to freeze, tend to remember the shock a little bit more than mice who are not fed probiotics. And again, with respect to stress hormones, it seems like on conventional food, mice have one stress response, but when they're fed probiotics, they seem to have a diminished stress response. And so again, this seems to be that there's an effect of changing the microbiome of the gut microbiome using probiotics on learning and memory and behavior. Probiotics even alter emotional responses in humans. So this is a functional MRI test. People look at frowny faces that are exhibiting negative affect, and they have to match the faces, but it's basically they're processing negative emotion. And then functional MRI is done while they're doing this, and you ask sort of what parts of the brain are they using. And so these are people who are fed milk products, these were people who are fed nothing, and these are people who are fed probiotics. And so based on this experiment, it seems like people who are fed probiotics tend to process negative emotion differently than if they're not fed probiotics. So this is a little bit controversial, and I don't want to go too much into it, but the data are out there, and I feel like it's important to talk about. So this was a study published in 2000. These were a series of children with autism. Their behavior was rated at baseline by their physicians, and then they were given a course of antibiotics, vancomycin. And what the investigators hoped was they actually hoped that by giving vancomycin to these children, they would change their gut microbiome. And during treatment, it seemed like behavior improved, but this was not long lasting. After the antibiotic use was terminated, behavior seemed to decline to where it was before they started the trial. The problem with this study is that there's no control group, so it's really hard to evaluate. But I think it's worth talking about because we know that antibiotic use can affect the gut microbiome, and so it's possible that this behavioral effect is somehow being mediated by the gut microbiome. I just want to be clear, I am not advocating sustained antibiotic use or off-label antibiotic use in individuals with autism. So this is a beautiful study about individuals with autism who have experienced fever. This study actually was done out of the school from the Department of Epidemiology. And so 103 children with autism were recruited to this study. It was during a particular time in Baltimore when there was an epidemic going around, so these kids were likely to get sick. And so the parents were given a special thermometer to measure their kids' temperature and a structured kind of instrument with which to rate their behavior. And all of the parents measured their kids' temperature, and all of the parents rated the kids' behavior. And then at the end of the trial, it turned out that 30 kids had fever, and so those 30 kids who had fever were matched on certain key variables to 30 kids who didn't have fever. And of course, as you'd expect, lethargy and hyperactivity, lethargy increased in the kids who had fever, and hyperactivity decreased in the kids who had fever. But also stereotypy and inappropriate speech seemed to improve in the kids who had fever. And so we know that fever affects the gut microbiome. I showed you some data on that. And so again, maybe these behavioral effects are being mediated by the gut microbiome. There's some previous evidence of altered gut microbiome in individuals with autism. And so all of these studies have been done, and some have found changes in the gut microbiome. These studies are kind of difficult to compare for a lot of reasons. They use very different technology, and sort of disappointingly, the sample sizes are actually quite small. In some samples use controls, and some samples use controls in neurotypical siblings. I think this is lovely preliminary data that supports the idea that the gut microbiome may be altered in autism, but I think these studies need to be interpreted with caution. And the reason why these studies need to be interpreted with caution is because there's a few things we know about autism. We know that feeding disorders are extremely prevalent. One study puts the prevalence of feeding disorders is about 5 times the general population. Feeding disorders are likely to profoundly affect the gut microbiome. If you don't take into account dietary practices or feeding disorders, your view of the gut microbiome could be incredibly skewed. We know there's possibly and probably increased GI disorders in autism. In fact, in 2010, the American Academy of Pediatrics convened a special group to look at the data, and the conclusion was there's not enough data and there should be more high-quality studies of GI dysfunction in autism. Specifically, is there increased prevalence? Is there increased severity? What types of GI disorders may exist in kids with autism? But certainly, we know that GI disorders must affect the gut microbiome, and so if you're going to measure the gut microbiome and take this into account, I think you need to incorporate sort of GI disorders. And finally, we know that there's parental dietary manipulation. And I think that this is just as much a response to the feeding disorders as it is dietary manipulation is something parents can do to help their kids. They can't do anything else, but they can try to feed their kids better food or different food to influence their behavior. And so given that we know that this is going on, and this is going on, and this is going on, it seems critical to take into account all of these confounding variables if you're going to measure the gut microbiome. So I told you what to do. Now I'm going to tell you, I told you what not to do. Now I'd like to tell you what you should do. So I think the only way, or not the only way, but a really great way to study the gut microbiome would be to do it prospectively, actually not in established autism, but prior to onset of symptoms. I think if you sample the gut microbiota prior to onset of ASD, you'll actually sample it in that critical period of neurodevelopment when pathways are being formed. I think as long as you're going to do this study, you should incorporate feeding disorders, some side of feeding dietary. I would get the very best pediatric disorders, feeding disorders specialists I could, and I'd have them sort of tag along and do feeding disorders prospectively at the same time. When do they arise? What kind of feeding disorders exist? And how do they affect the developing gut microbiome? I'd incorporate GI evaluation going forward, and I'd ask the same questions. Is it the GI disorders that come first, or the feeding disorders that come first? Is it changes in the gut microbiome that come first? And while this isn't an easy study, the hardest part of it, the prospective study design, that infrastructure actually already exists in the form of baby SIB studies. There are many all around the country. There's one at the Marcus Autism Center. There's one here. There are a few. And so I'm not saying that this is easy, but I'm saying that the hardest part is done. And so it actually, I think, is feasible to take some modules like this and incorporate them into a baby SIB study. and really get at what's going on with the gut microbiome, feeding disorders, and the GI system. And finally, I think that if we're going to do these studies, it would be really important to respect the heterogeneity of autism. We know it's very heterogeneous. We know there are multiple causes. I think it's a mistake to get a really small sample and then assume that you're going to see an effect size. The gut microbiome may be relevant for 5 or 10 or 20% of kids, but you need to sample enough kids so that you give yourself the best chance of seeing an effect. And the final thing I want to say is that there are some major hypotheses, exciting hypotheses, floating around about the mechanism of autism, and they include the immune system, and they include diet, and they include host genetics. And I think that all of these can't really be interpreted until we know what's going on with the gut microbiome. One study is going to find that probiotics help, another study is going to find that they don't, but if you measured the gut microbiome, you might actually be able to explain those disparate results and come up with some relevant conclusions. So I thank you for listening, and great.
Thank you so much, Jen, for another inspiring talk. So we're going to end the first session by switching gears a little bit, although I'm happy to introduce yet another school alum. Dr. David Mandell is an associate professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, where he also directs the Center for Mental Health Policy and Services Research. And so we're moving from characterization and etiology to thinking about policy and services, again, taking the whole spectrum of public health impact into our consideration. So please, welcome. Let me help you get.
It's the one that says Wendy, yeah.
Yeah, great.
We just had a big conversation at lunch about how you should try and keep text off your slides. But I wanted to show you this. It's really nice to be back. I spent entirely too much time in this room and at Hampton House, and I realized as I was putting together these slides, first of all, how much this would feel like my dissertation defense, and that got me really nervous. And the second thing was how much I learned in my studies here that is directly applicable to what I'm going to talk about today. So for example, my title, Building a System of Care for People with Autism, comes from Phil Leaf, from my dissertation advisor, who helped me understand how multiple systems connect, and sometimes well, sometimes not so well, to care for people who are in need. My love of the history of how we conceptualize unusual behavior in people comes from Bill Eaton, who's sitting in the middle. And this slide is sort of a sort of an homage to him in some ways. This comes from a chart from a state psychiatric hospital. We were hired by the state of Pennsylvania to go in and look for undiagnosed autism in state psychiatric hospitals. I was really skeptical of this. It's very difficult to assess these folks. They're heavily meted up. They've been institutionalized sometimes for 40, 50, 60 years. We ended up talking to a lot of parents who are in their 80s and 90s. This comes from the chart of someone whose mother we talked with. She was 92 when we talked with her. We did the ADI with her about her son, who was in his 60s or his 60s then, and they lived in Philadelphia, and they had come down to Hopkins to talk to someone to help them explain their son's behavior. And this is the intake note. And it's kind of interesting that they'd been told that they had a retarded child who should be put in an institution. And they didn't want to put him in an institution, and so they went to a school in Philadelphia that specialized in helping kids with challenging behavior. He had real problems with behavior, but 20 years before Lovaas and just a few years after Skinner published his seminal work, he had a teacher who created a behavior chart for him. And I've highlighted the cool stuff here, I think. And he took wholeheartedly to the idea, enjoyed working for rewards, and has quieted down considerably. Right? And so he's getting better in school. His academic work is getting better, but his social adjustment is very poor. He does this a lot with his fingers. He's echolalic. All this stuff is in this note. When asked, do you want water, he would answer, do you want water? And so you may recognize the physician they consulted was Leo Connor. And I love that it's signed by both Dr. Connor and Dr. Welch, who saw this child. who described him as psychotic. And so this is Leo Connor's typewriter, by the way, who described him as psychotic and difficult to handle. He's got a sister, a younger sister, and Dr. Connor described this as potentially a big source of social embarrassment for the sister, recommended one of two things. Either he be put in one of Pennsylvania's fine institutions, many fine institutions, or that he be put with a family in what was called a dog patch community. So put in a rural area where he would stay with a family who would not be concerned with social niceties. And so we talked to this 92-year-old mother about the agony she had. She disregarded these recommendations completely. She kept him in the school, and then he, when as his sister got older, he became increasingly violent towards the sister. And finally, she felt she had no choice, and she put him here. She put him in Norristown State Psychiatric Hospital. And we used to love our state psychiatric hospitals as a society. At one point, there were 500,000, 500,000 people in state psychiatric hospitals across the U.S. And this is from a postcard. States would have postcards of their hospitals, and this is what it looks like now. And this is what it looked like a few years ago when we went to do a clinical assessment, when we went to look at the prevalence of autism in these state psychiatric institutions, finding that 10% of these folks were diagnosed with undifferentiated schizophrenia. We would have diagnosed them with autism. And you think, well, things are getting better. Right? You think we live in a very different society than we did in 1954 when this boy was brought down to see Drs. Connor and Welsh. The fact is we are still institutionalizing our children, and we are still hospitalizing them. So this is from a survey of 1,000 families in Pennsylvania that we did, and this is the probability of hospitalization. And you can see among children born between 1983 and 1994, by the time they reached 21, about 35% of them had been psychiatrically hospitalized for some period of time. And what was particularly disturbing to me is when we did a median split of the sample, and so we looked at the younger cohort, different from the older cohort, we find that for children born between 1994 and 1999, that the risk of hospitalization is actually higher than it is for the older children, which does not suggest that we are moving in the right direction. And so, that was a pretty fabulous talk about the microbiome. I learned a lot. I was a little grossed out, and I do agree that it is a very important area to study. But I also want to make a pitch that any school that's going to have a public health program to address issues related to autism has to focus on service and policy. And I love the fact that that is part of the description of the mission, and I'm going to hope by the end of this talk, I think I have another 25 minutes, that you'll move it up in the priority list. So one of the things that changed dramatically over the last 60 years is that the number of children that we diagnose with autism has increased dramatically, and they've increased both in absolute numbers and as a percentage of the general population and as a percentage of the children that we identified as having special learning needs. So in 1990, we passed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, a reauthorization of an existing act, and for the first time, autism was its own category of special education. And it was the first time we had a real administrative count of how many children in the U.S. Were diagnosed with autism. And we'll take out the first couple of years. A lot of states didn't comply in the first couple of years, but in 1993, we have about 23,000 children diagnosed with autism. By 1997, we have about 50,000. They comprise less than 1% of all children with autism in special education. And by 2010, the latest year for which we have data that comprise more than 6% of the total special education population, and there are almost 400,000 of them. And their care costs a lot. So this is, I think, the study that was referenced in the very moving Autism Speaks video, and this is, we received some funds from Autism Speaks to try and estimate what the cost of autism is. And we used a societal cost strategy, and we came up with a number of about $130 billion a year in the U.S. And I put some other diseases there to give you some perspective. Being born has a cost associated with it. So we can use that as a baseline. But if you look at some of the costs associated with different disorders, you see that autism is way up there. And this combination of the growing prevalence and the extraordinary costs associated with caring for these children has created a crisis among the systems that are tasked with serving these children. And you can see what those systems are by looking at the costs. And $130 billion is a number. It doesn't tell you what you should do with that number. There's no value associated with it. But you can break down where those costs arise, and it could give you some sense of who's tasked with caring for these folks. So, and I did this by age because, as we know, the costs associated with children with different disorders change as they age, and especially in the early years, we see huge expenditures associated with special education. This is the system where our children are spending the most time other than with their families, and as they age, it changes. And what you see is, that doesn't work. All right, you don't see anything. Help. You don't know. I've come across a problem that does this one work? Hey, look at that. All right, I'm not even going to try again.
The little thing that has a red dot.
Nope, not doing it. No. And so what you see is that as they age, just as we saw from those hospitalization numbers, where the bulk of our expenditures go is to medical care and to residential care. And those are the systems that become tasked with caring for older adults or older individuals for adults with autism. And so Shep Kellum is here, and I just put with acknowledgement to Kellum and Hoare in 1997, using your life course developmental epidemiology approach to think about the systems that are responsible, that are tasked with caring for individuals with autism, or who should. And at the bottom, we have families. And that is sort of the base upon which all of this is built. And for many people with autism, frankly, that is the only support that they will get. And we often talk about the burden and the challenges parents face. And as we think about an aging population of individuals with autism, we think that those stressors and that challenge switch from the parent to the sibling. We often think about the education system, which begins with the early, and even within the education system, we have an extraordinarily fractured system. So we have the early intervention system, which is paid for out of Part C IDEA federal dollars, which is responsible for caring or providing services to children from birth to 5. They then make a transition to the public education system, which is tasked with caring for them from when they enter kindergarten through the age of 22. And then under the U.S. Department of Education is the Rehabilitation Services Administration, which is tasked with providing them with vocational support. And that's supposed to start at 14. In any individualized education plan you see for a high schooler with autism, it should have something in there about skill development and vocational development that is going to help that person achieve the greatest level of independence that they can when they leave high school. For those of you who have seen a lot of IEPs, you will know that that's really not in there as much as we would like. There's the medical care issues, both because these folks have a lot of co-occurring medical conditions that they need care for, and also because we haven't decided as a society whether the basic behavioral interventions that have been shown to have the most effect for these kids are a medical issue or an educational issue. And I'll talk in a minute about the tremendous finger pointing that goes on about who should be paying for this care. And these folks also develop a lot of other psychiatric comorbidities. Anxiety is extraordinarily disabling, and frankly, for some people with autism, more disabling than the autism itself. Depression is common, especially among folks who are on academic grade levels, spend a lot of time with their typically developing peers, and don't understand why, they want friendships, and they don't understand why they don't have friendships. And so depression and loneliness are often common as well. And then there's the issue of housing, because families are going to need to make a plan for these folks. And there are some really creative solutions that different groups have come up with, but on the whole, for more severely affected individuals, we still rely very heavily on a traditional residential care system. So in the midst of this, lots of people are jumping into the debate, and lots of people are trying to figure out what we should do to support these individuals. So Mr. Wright mentioned the autism insurance mandate. So now 34 states have enacted legislation requiring commercial insurance plans to cover some set of services for children with autism. That's about half of the people in those states, and there's still states that are not. And actually, Colleen Barry, who's on faculty in HPM here, and I have an R01 to examine the effects of the state mandates to see what it does to do all of a sudden people with autism come out of the woodwork in terms of diagnoses, what happens to the services they receive, and what are the associated costs, and should commercial insurance companies be as worried about the associated costs as they claim that they are. Increasingly, the vocation, well, I want to actually, against these mandates are the issues of Medicaid. So we often as a society have decided to use public insurance to pay for services for these folks. And if you look at the graph on the bottom right, you'll see that the number of children, or the prevalence of children with autism in the Medicaid system, is increasing dramatically, and often through Social Security or waivers. That is, states are developing specialized plans under their Medicaid programs so that children with autism who otherwise would not be eligible for publicly funded services are now eligible for those services. And what's happening in states with waivers and mandates is Medicaid is saying, well, we'll start the waiver because commercial insurance won't cover this, but we're the payer of last resort. And so now that many states have enacted mandates, the Medicaid waiver programs are saying, we're not going to pay. You have to go to your commercial insurance plans first. And of course, enacting legislation and enforcing legislation are two very different things. And so there may be some really negative unintended consequences of the collision of these mandates and the waivers. Everyone is very concerned about the Affordable Care Act and what is that going to do for services for people with autism. One of the essential health benefits, which was originally designed to cover services for people with psychiatric disorders and substance abuse, had appended to it at almost the 11th hour and behavioral treatments, which was specifically designed to cover services for people with autism. And it still remains to be seen how states will play out the enforcement of that last clause on that essential health benefit, and whether that means that states will now cover through their insurance marketplaces services for children with autism. And the vocational rehabilitation system, which was designed to serve returning vets who had suffered limb loss and help them develop skills for the workplace, is increasingly being tasked with developing skills in people who are physically intact but have challenges to participating in the workplace. And the percentage of people with autism that comprises the voc rehab caseload has been increasing dramatically. Before 2002, it was functionally zero. And over the last 10 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of people with autism who are taking advantage of voc rehab services. When you look, interestingly, at their service experience, you find out that they are the most expensive. That is, they are using some more dollars than, more voc rehab dollars than a lot of other groups, but they have some of the best outcomes. That is, when people with autism get appropriate voc rehab services, they actually end up in the workplace doing well, with incomes that are above the minimum wage. So if you have a chance to vote to raise the minimum wage, that's a good idea. Now, there's a parallel body of research that's going on. Right? On the one hand, we're thinking about policies and services at the 1,000-foot view. How do we, as a society, structure the organization, financing, and delivery of care to people with autism so that it best meets their needs? And on the other side, we're developing better and better treatments for people with autism, and we're able to identify children with autism younger and younger in university-based research settings and get them into treatment. And we're showing that when you get those very young children into treatment, the outcomes are extraordinary. So this is the results from one of the most popular and publicized programs, the Early Start Denver model, which was developed by Sally Rogers and Jerry Dawson. They had a very exciting randomized trial. this could just as easily be early achievements developed by Rebecca Landa here at Kennedy Krieger, or the Jasper model developed by Connie Kassery at UCLA. But when you see kids in these interventions and you compare them to what they're getting in the community, you see extraordinary outcomes. So on the left is cognition, so functionally IQ, and you see relative to the control group great gains in cognition in the first year and that difference maintains into the second year post intervention, and adaptive behavior in the other graph, which is when you think about what actually gets families through the day and what gets kids to school and doing well, maybe as or more important than cognition. And by year 2, you see substantial differences in adaptive behavior between kids in the intervention group and kids in the control group. So this is very exciting work and looks absolutely nothing like the services we are delivering to children in the community. And so when you think about services and policies, one aspect of services and policies is creating access, right? And a lot of what we're doing with mandates and with waivers and other kinds of mechanisms like this is creating access, financial access, geographic access. But what we're not doing is creating quality. And the other half of the mission of a services and policy research center needs to be focused on how you create quality at the community level. And just to show you, I was fortunate enough to get these data, and we used some of the metrics that we developed for that cost study and applied them to the services that kids in the intervention group and the control group got. And when you look at the costs associated with Early Start Denver model versus the control group, the kids who are in community services, you see a substantial increase in cost early for these kids, and by age 10 and a half, you see the lines cross for return on investment. Right? So, and some of this is projected because we didn't have enough data on all the kids for that far out. But what's very exciting is that if we can deliver these services well, then kids need fewer services later on. And as a society, we reap an economic benefit, and that economic benefit comes relatively early. So one of the challenges we have in moving these interventions into community settings is that how we conceptualize efficacy, that is, how do programs work under ideal circumstances, and how we conceptualize effectiveness are very different. When you do the traditional randomized trial, you get a grant, you can pay for everything, it's very exciting, you have highly supervised clinicians, they're often your grad students, they're a little afraid of you, they do exactly what you want, and you can have restrictive inclusion-exclusion criteria. It is perfectly reasonable to say we are only taking people who have a mental age of, or kids who have a mental age of 24 months, toilet trained, and no self-injurious behaviors, right? And imagine if I said that to one of the public school teachers that we work with. Like, no teacher gets to stand at the door of her classroom and say, "I'm sorry, in order to be in this classroom, you have to be toilet trained," as much as they would like to, right? And as a result, I think districts take on a lot trying to figure out what to do for these schools. So I consult to some school districts. And the first thing I always ask them is, what are you doing with your kids? Give me a list of the programs you use. This is a list from one district. There are a lot of things on this list. Some of them are contraindicated with each other, and no one could be expert in all of these. And so what we end up doing in our attempt to serve all children is having community clinicians become mediocre at a lot of things, right? And warehouses are filled in districts with these programs that we bought one year and decided, and next year we decided that wasn't what we needed. And there are other scientists from other disciplines who are thinking about this, and I think the most exciting area that we could apply in this setting comes from implementation research. And Enola Proctor at Washington University has been doing a lot of great work in this area. And what she suggests is that we have an intervention strategy, and ultimately we're interested in patient outcomes. But when we think about that intervention delivered in a community setting, there are a lot of things in between. and that we have system level and organizational level and in my case teacher, sometimes clinician level factors that affect the extent to which that intervention is going to be delivered as designed, and that the outcomes are going to mirror what we see in university-based research settings. And so that's where I've been spending a lot of my time lately, partnering with the School District of Philadelphia. I wanted to present this model also. So this is a lot older one, theory of reasoned action. We often think about this when we're trying to affect things like substance use or health behaviors or condom use. I say it is a very short leap from condom use to discrete trial training. That ultimately, when we're trying to incentivize behavior in the community, when we're trying to get teachers to implement an evidence-based practice or physicians to implement an evidence-based practice, this is about adult behavior change. And we should be turning to the literature on adult behavior change and applying it in the same way. Right? And we especially need to be doing this in the largest school districts in the U.S., of which Philadelphia is one and Baltimore is one. There are 18,000 school districts in the United States. The top 100 in size, so 0.6%, serve 23% of all children in the U.S. The top 500 in the U.S., so 2.8% of all school districts, serve 43% of all children in the U.S. If we want to make change, we need to focus on the urban areas in which we sit. And if we can figure out how to make change there, we can affect a disproportionately huge number of children who need our help. Right? So we ran a randomized trial in the School District of Philadelphia to look at, but we compared two classroom-based interventions, seeing if we can improve the use of evidence-based practice. And what we found is that in these two conditions, when fidelity was low, there was no difference between the conditions. And when fidelity was high, there was a big difference between the conditions, and it doesn't matter what they are. There are a lot of off-the-shelf programs that you could use and probably see similar results. But what was startling to us was if you look at program fidelity, that the average fidelity on a 100-point scale in one group was 57%, and in the other group it was less than 50%. And we spent a lot of time in the classroom supporting these teachers, trying to help them, and they seemed to love our consultants. And one of the things we became interested in is the climate. And we went to Wharton, the business school across the street from us, and found that, they study implementation climate, issues like, you know, if you have to retool your plant because there's a new technology, how do you think about making sure that happens in a good way, in an effective way? And we thought, oh, we have a new technology. It's these programs that we want to implement. And can we use their same measures and see if it affects what happens in the school? And essentially, you're asking, is this program expected? Does the principal expect you to use it? Are you supported in its use? And are you rewarded for using it? And we asked them about that in September, and we measured fidelity in May. And what you see is that there's a moderate correlation between what they said in September about expectations, support, and reward, and the fidelity to the program in May. What was more interesting to me is that there's an interaction between climate and fidelity. So where you see the best outcomes are in the high climate, high fidelity conditions. That makes sense. What is more interesting is where you see the second best outcomes are in the low climate, low fidelity condition. Right? So these are teachers saying, nobody's rewarding me for doing this, nobody supports me doing this, and I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do something else. And so in the field, we have teachers who are making important adaptations or are coming up with programs on their own and doing very well. And it's resulting in good outcomes for kids. And so as much as we think about evidence-based practice, we also need to be thinking about practice-based evidence. And how do we look at what's happening in the field that's effective and learn from that, learn what happens in some of these very under-resourced environments, and think about how it can positively affect how we change intervention in these low-resource settings. And I've begun to think about this in terms of this engineering flow chart that I found, right? So, which says, does it move? No. Should it? Yes. WD-40. Right? Does it move? Yes. Should it? No. Duct tape. And I've been thinking about what's our equivalent. You know, Bob Wright, you talked about low-cost interventions. What's our low-cost equivalent? What's our WD-40 and our duct tape? And we've been focusing on, after a very long time in these settings, we figure we need to do 4 things. We need to get teachers to use visual schedules. We need to get them to use positive reinforcement, often with a token economy. We need them to do data collection. They hate data collection. And we need them to pull kids for one-to-one intervention every day for 20 minutes. And for those of you who care, it turns out that PRT seems to be, pivotal response training, seems to work a lot better than discrete trial training in these settings, right? And one of the things, and then, now that we know there are 4 things that we want to ask them about, that we want them to do, instead of saying we want you to do STAR, this huge complex program, or we want you to do structured teaching, this huge complex program, we say, here are the 4 things we want you to do. And then we can ask them if they intend to do each of those 4 things. And it turns out that they vary in the extent to which they'll do those 4 things. So 2/3 of them say they intend to use positive reinforcement. I'm a little concerned about the third of teachers who say they're not going to use positive reinforcement, right? There are half of them say they're going to use visual schedules, or strongly agree that they intend to use visual schedules. About 40% say they're going to do one-to-one instruction, and a third say they're going to do data collection. Like I said, they hate data collection. And this has led us to understand that in incentivizing this kind of large-scale, complex program, we may need to incentivize different pieces of it differently. And so where our research is going is more now into the fields of behavioral economics. And so we've been thinking about what other strategies do we have available to us to change adult behavior, and can we do it differently for the different techniques we're asking teachers to implement? So the Thaler and Sunstein book is probably the most popular one on behavioral economics, Nudge. It's a great read. Reality is Broken by Jay McGonigal is how we use online technologies to think about changing adult behavior. Again, she's very interested in health, but we're thinking about can we do it for, can we use some of these online strategies for teachers and circumvent the organizational barriers they have. And this is, of course, my favorite cartoon about behavioral economics, that somehow if you move the fruit closer to Homer and the cupcakes away, or donuts away, he's so lazy that he'll just eat the fruit. I don't think about these teachers as lazy. I think about them as some of the hardest working people I've ever met. Their lives are really hard, and when we give them stuff to do, we're making their lives harder. But I do think about what could we do to make it more beneficial to them and easier for them to do these interventions for kids with autism than we're asking them to do than what they're doing now. So I'll leave you with that thought, and thank you very much for your attention.
So I think we'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully folks will trickle back in. I know that was a much needed leg break for everyone. One of the things that I didn't emphasize when I welcomed everyone earlier today is that there really is this special place and hope that the Center for Autism and Developmental Disabilities does not forget the and developmental disabilities part, and that in fact we think broadly about autism and the autisms as well as developmental disabilities more broadly. And I think you can tell even from the talks that you heard this morning that it's hard to talk about these disorders without understanding development and developmental disabilities much more broadly than just a single diagnosis. And so the next talk will focus on developmental disabilities much more broadly than just autism. And also we'll take it from a global perspective, which is another important thing that our School of Public Health has to offer to the domain of autism and developmental disabilities research. And so with that, we're very happy to welcome Dr. Maureen Black. She's a professor of pediatrics as well as epidemiology and family and community medicine in the University of Maryland, which is nearby. She's also an adjunct professor here at the school and is involved in our Center for Nutrition and Health, as well as co-advising students over the years and really contributing to this School of Public Health as well as to the University of Maryland. So please welcome Dr. Black.
Great, thank you very much. I'd certainly like to thank Mike and the organizing committee for inviting me. I had the pleasure of knowing Wendy and remember spending one morning with her, and when she realized that I had trained in developmental disabilities at UCLA, then we had a talk about some of the challenges and the lack of services and all of the things that needed to be done to help children with disabilities and to help their families. So I think she'd be thrilled to know that this center is being formed and will go forward, and so we'll have many more students who are trained and research that's being done to make life easier for those who have disabilities, to prevent disabilities, to make it easier for those who have it, as well as for their families. So my charge today is to focus on developmental disabilities from a global perspective. Now, let me see. Okay, so the objective is to look at the global prevalence of developmental disabilities. We're going to talk about measurement. We'll talk a bit about measurement to policy, and then we'll talk a bit about global programs in autism and some recommendations, again, from a global perspective. Well, what has happened, if we look at UNICEF, each year UNICEF has a State of the World's Children. So what did they have for 2013? They focused on disabilities. So this is a very impressive publication that's available on the web. You just look at UNICEF, and so you'll see that they're focused on disabilities, and there's a discussion paper that goes with it that focuses on early childhood development and disabilities. So that this is, the disability community was ecstatic to see that UNICEF has put an emphasis and a focus into disabilities. And of course now what we're waiting for are more programs and more opportunities and something more than just what's written on paper. But it's very nice to see that, that there's a recognition at UNICEF. There's also an active group that looks at disabilities and continues to nudge. So if we look at what guides disabilities from a global perspective, there's the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CRC, and that's been signed by 193 countries, not ours. And the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. These are two conventions, these are two broad statements that focus on the rights of those with disabilities, people with disabilities, and they focus more on rights than they do on issues related to protection. This is a guiding principle. When you think about disabilities from a global perspective, there are often talks about rights and about these two conventions. They focus on inclusion and involvement and are very much focused on support for families. If we look at the causes of developmental disabilities, these are some of the same causes that you've heard in some of the previous talks, but there are some that you can see that are really specific to a global perspective. So we have the genetic contributions or abnormalities. We have birth defects, the illnesses or injuries or poor nutrition and sanitation. So the sanitation is one that is more likely in a global context. Certainly the poverty and lack of access to health care, exposure to violence that can lead to developmental disabilities. And here we're thinking about home violence, which may be child abuse as well as community violence. There's evidence that maternal stress and depression can be a cause of disabilities. And certainly the lack of opportunities for early learning and responsivity, that in some particularly low and middle income countries, there are very limited early learning opportunities. Then we have toxic exposures of a variety of kinds, and the natural disasters that we read about with too much frequency, and of course armed conflict. And that's not one that anyone has talked about thus far. But unfortunately, in much of our world, we have armed conflict, and as some of the pictures that I've included will show us, that children are often victims to that, and that can lead to disabilities. So bearing in mind, we're thinking about, this is a broad perspective, so in developmental disabilities, we're including autism, including physical disabilities, and also including mental disabilities. So what are some of the consequences of developmental disabilities? Well, a large consequence, of course, is the loss of potential. And that's a potential to have a childhood that is quote unquote typical, and it can be a loss of potential then to be able to contribute throughout the lifespan in a way that is typical. So that's the loss of potential can be a heartache to the person with the disability as well as the family and as well as their community. Speaking a little more specifically, the consequences can be vulnerability and stigma, and associated with that can be isolation, exclusion from services, exclusion from school. And there's evidence that children who have a disability are at increased risk for violence. And there we're talking about extreme discipline or child abuse, and that it can be challenging raising a child with a disability and so some increased risk of violence. There's certainly a family stress, and you heard some about the family stress this morning, and the need for additional services or need for additional help or caregiving can contribute to poverty and a need for social protection. And so that can include both the current and cost of services currently, as well as limited opportunities in the future. When I put the need for social protection, in our country, we have resources such as SSI that can help with social protection, but in much of the world, nothing like that exists. So sometimes the rest of the world is really quite different from what we're able to do in this country. Now, if we look at the epidemiology, how many children do we have? Well, the estimate that is frequently given and given in the 2013 State of the World's Children from UNICEF that I showed you is that there are 93 million children, or 1 in 20 of children under 15. But where did that estimate come from? That's a very crude estimate that was updated in 2004. Now, there, as you saw from the some of the graphs this morning, the rates have clearly been have increased since 2004, and case finding differs. So this estimate is really made on sand in that they're inconsistent methods of to define or identify children who are disabled. Some have been culturally appropriate, some have been culturally inappropriate. So that 93 million is really a somewhat questionable number. In a study that I was involved with, we identified 219 million children of not reaching their developmental potential. That's not having a disability, as it were, but it's not reaching your potential, largely defined by nutritional contributions as well as extreme poverty. But when we think about it, over 80%, and it's really probably closer to over 90% of children with disabilities live in low and middle income countries. So they don't have access to some of the wonderful resources that you heard about this morning. They don't have access to the research. They don't even have access to the case finding. So we don't even know how many there are or where they are. So one of the things that the center has an opportunity to do is to expand and look at both some of the case finding as well as the research as well as the treatment in much of the rest of the world. So how do we measure disability? How does one do that? Well, WHO has the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health, or ICF as it's called. So they look at body structure and function. So that means if your eyes are not functioning, if you are blind or you are hard of hearing and you can't hear, eyes and sight or other kinds of structural damage, then you could have a disability. But there's also, in addition to that, there's a functional component. So the functional component essentially covers what we've called activities of daily living, or it includes basically being able to participate in individual activities. So it's being able to play with other children, it's being able to go to school, it's being able to work. So there's the functional component in addition to the body structure and function. The functional component is interpreted in context. So what is the cultural context, and then how does that apply to disabilities? So general surveys are very likely to underestimate the rate of disabilities. And as you can imagine, these are frequently done in different ways in different countries. So what happened is that in the 80s, something called the 10 questions were developed. These were developed at the Sergievsky Center at Columbia, which is a center that crosses medicine and public health. So they developed a screener called the 10 questions, and then they tested these, evaluated these 10 questions using these rapid epidemiological surveys that focused on children from ages 2 to 9. Now, since this was developed, there's been one question that has been added, a language question that's focused on children under age 2. I'm going to show you these questions in a minute so you can see them. The way that these questions were meant to be used is through a two-stage process. So the idea is that you would screen children using these 10 questions. They're based on parent report. And then you would follow up those who screened positive as well as a sample of those who screened negative. And then you would come up with your estimate of disability. So the original tests, the original evaluations for these were done in Bangladesh and Pakistan and Jamaica. Okay, so what has happened? Well, these are I'll show you in the next 2 slides what these 10 questions, referred to as the TQ, look like. So they ask a parent, does or did your child have any serious delays in sitting, standing, or walking, seeing at night or daytime or night, or hearing, like using a hearing aid? Well, the likelihood of having a hearing aid is not high. And then they go on, when you tell your child to do something, does he seem to understand? Does the child have difficulty walking or moving? And does the child sometimes have fits? And then the remaining questions ask about, does your child learn to do things like other children his age? Can your child speak? If the child is is 2 to 9, then it asks if their speech is different from normal. And under age 2, can the child name at least one object? And then compared with other children, does he appear in any way mentally backward or slow? These are the 10 questions. Okay. So what has happened with those questions is there are no questions at all on socio-emotional development, on behavior, or participation in activities or social interactions. So there are some holes in these questions, but they have been validated. And so what has happened is they've now been incorporated into the UNICEF multi-country indicator cluster survey, or the MIX. So what that means is that these questions are available from many, many, many countries throughout the world, well over 60 countries. Countries can choose when they're doing the mix what modules to include, but many countries have included the questions on the TQ, or the 10 questions on disabilities. The plus of them is that they're applied consistently across countries, so parents are asked to respond to these questions. The concern is that parents may underreport because they don't recognize them, or they want to reduce stigma. But another concern is that they overreport because there's a temporary condition. So you have a concern of both under and over. Probably the over-reporting is a bigger concern. But what we see is some variability across countries, ranging from 3% in Uzbekistan and 48% in the Central African Republic. Now, what's happened is that in the mix, they don't do the two-stage that I described to you before of following the screen with an evaluation, a medical and an educational evaluation. They just do the screen. Looking at some countries that have done the TQ, at Bangladesh, the rate was 8%, and Uganda, the rate was 25%. So there's some variability across countries. But the plus is that these data do exist, and it's done in a somewhat consistent form across countries. So it has enabled more attention to be on disabilities, as evidenced by the 2013 State of the World's Children, and enables you to look within countries around disabilities. One of the papers, or one of the ways that we learned that family violence is higher among families who have a disabled child is through an analysis of these mixed data. So that there are many things that one can do with these data. They're publicly available, and so there are certainly things that students who were at the center, who were interested in disabilities, could do by looking at these secondary data. I wanted to talk a little bit about the follow-up of the 10 questions and what can happen with them. So in Cambodia, for example, on a follow-up for hearing impairment, what they found is that there were some children who had ear infections or had earwax. So these are clearly treatable conditions. So what it illustrates is by screening for these kinds of issues, then you identify conditions that can be treated and can be treated relatively easily. So it increases the sensitivity around questions, around issues that could help children. In Bhutan, the example was that the government recognized that there were more cognitive disabilities among low-income families. So they focused their early childhood education and child care in rural areas. So there are certainly many things that can come from these data within countries that will enable assessment to move towards intervention, or really, in the case of Bhutan, even to move toward policy changes. So again, those are things that students or faculty could help with in terms of helping countries use the data that they already have, having more programs for children with disabilities. So if we're going to switch a little bit and talk about autism. As you can imagine, when we look at the changes that we've had in autism in this country, they've been really very, very recent. So what do we expect to find in the rest of the world? Well, first we see that the screening that would be done with the TQ, how would that work in terms of identifying autism? Not so good, because it really doesn't focus on some of the issues that we see in autism. So let's see what we find. There was a paper that was published a year or so ago that is a review of what's known about autism in the rest of the world. And if you can read it, you can see that there are some data from Europe, from America, from Western Pacific. But when we look at low and middle income countries, it's really pretty much a void. So what the paper talks about is that when you look at the year that the studies were done, this is a review. When you look at the year the studies were done, there's an association between that and the prevalence rate. So the more recent studies did a better job of case finding. Fine, that certainly makes sense. But there's no consistency in methods and basically no information from low and middle income countries. There was an editorial that followed this from a group from low and middle income countries that said we need better methods, and in fact we're developing better methods to be able to look at this, but do not think that the problem does not exist, because it does. So these are two examples from India and Bangladesh of neurodevelopmental screeners, one developed by the INCLEN, the International Clinical Epidemiological Network, and the other in Bangladesh. This has been published in Pediatrics by Naila Khan, looking at early neurodevelopmental screening that is focused on developmental disabilities, but also has components that look at autism within these screens. Now, what's happened in Bangladesh, and you've heard references to Bangladesh before, which is an extremely poor country, the highest population density in the world, except for city-states. But what they've done is develop some national screening using their neurodevelopmental assessment. And this is Bangladesh, and the dots represent the places where they have screening sites and where then they have centers. They put the centers in medical schools, but then have community outreaches from these centers. And they've increased, the dark blue was 2008 and 9, up to the light blue 9 and 10, and then the red ones are 2013 and what's emerging in 2014. So you can see they're spread out. So they do the screening, and over the past, from 2009 to 2013, they've had over 85,000 visits. And then what they work on, their focus is really on center and community-based rehabilitation. So it's looking for programs that you can implement using low-cost methods, because they don't have high costs, and they don't have a whole bevy of well-trained therapists or teachers or really anyone else. So they use train-the-trainer models in order to reach out and provide services, and these are community-based, but often in-home services. This is an example of Uganda, and what Uganda has done, and there are other countries that have done this also, is that they've taken these 10 questions and they've added additional questions that, if you read them, you will see that they move further into function, and they move further into some of the issues that that feel a bit more like that represent autism. So Uganda has developed, it's rather than a 10 question, it's a 23 question. So they've added some additional questions, and these are some specific ones that they've added for children under 5, because they'd like their case finding to be as early as possible, as we all would, so that services can be started very early in life. So this is what they have done in Uganda, but other countries have done this as well. These are published. And what they've done in Uganda is they've instituted the 2-step procedure, the way the TQ was developed in the first place, and then they've evaluated the prevalence of autism within Uganda and look at the sensitivity of the TQ and then the sensitivity with their additional questions, and then develop some services. So this is an example of what's happening in some developing countries. There's certainly a desire to work on these issues, but there are many, many roadblocks. Many more roadblocks in developing countries than we have. And this is one of the big roadblocks. What is this? If we look at preschool enrollment, and these are data from UNICEF, but if we look at preschool enrollment in some parts of the world, so if we look, for example, at South Asia, this is not preschool enrollment for children with disabilities. This is preschool enrollment for everybody. So their preschool enrollment is under 20%. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, these are based on wealth quintiles. So for South Asia, it's low for everybody. In Africa, there's a gradient, but even at the top, it's a third. So it's very difficult then to balance the resources that are available for all children with resources that are needed for children with disabilities. So the argument would be we need to bump this up for typically developing children as well as children with disabilities. But I included this just as a highlight of what some of the challenges are in moving forward with the things that we know children need. So in summary, there's certainly a global concern regarding developmental disabilities, including autism. There are multiple risk factors that place children at risk, and it's a major societal challenge. We have global data from the mix, so we know something about the disabilities and how prevalent they are, with caution. There are national identification procedures that are emerging, and certainly a desire for more programs. But there are limited programs and policies in low and middle income countries that provides an opportunity for future work. If we look at what some of the recommendations are globally, ending institutionalization, it still exists. I've visited institutions in Vietnam. I mean, they still exist. So focusing on inclusion, that's certainly an emphasis here as well. Inclusion in schools, as we increase the number of schools, include children with disabilities. Discrimination is a concern, and there's the sports for children with disabilities has been very helpful. So expanding sports, expanding those opportunities for children to be involved in a variety of ways. Increasing awareness of disabilities, certainly supporting families, that should probably be at the top, because in low and middle income countries, it's all about families. Moving beyond minimum standards, that's minimum standards in some parts of the world are really minimum. So thinking about more of an inclusion perspective and opportunities for children. These are coordinating services. Well, this could be any place, making sure that our services are coordinated, and that there are both individual services as well as policies and programs, such as the social protection that we have. The push towards involving children and adolescents in decisions as agents of change, not as passive recipients. And then having a global research agenda that generates the data that are needed for planning and resource evaluation, resource allocation and evaluation. Some of that comes from the mix, but as you can see, there are countries who would like more than that, and the mix is really based from data started in the 80s, and we've moved a long way from that. And so I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Black, so much. So we will do as we did in the first half and await questions till all folks are finished. So please write that question down if you had a burning one, because we will come back to it. And next, I would like to move to introducing Dr. Rebecca Landa. You may have heard earlier in Dr. Mandell's talk, he made reference to some of the early intervention and early identification work that she and many others are doing around the country. She is the director of the Center for Autism and Related Disabilities at the Kennedy Krieger Institute, is a dear friend and colleague and partner in crime in a lot of the epidemiology work that happens at this school, as well as her own research that she's about to tell you about. So we're very excited for the partnership opportunities between a sort of clinically focused center for characterization and intervention and a public health focused center for prevention and all the other things that we've already talked about today. So without further introduction, Dr. Landa. And do you know which one you are to start? Is that you? That's good. Okay.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and I want to extend a lot of thanks to my collaborators, Danny and Dr. Elizabeth Stewart, Luke Kalb, Kate Boswell, Alden Gross, Lee Ching. There's so many people here who are, as Danny said, treasured colleagues. So I'm going to be talking today about some discoveries that we've made about autism through studying infant siblings of children with autism. And I want to thank the National Institute of Mental Health, the wonderful families and their children who've participated in this work, and my wonderful staff. I also want to thank Dr. Goldstein for making it possible for me to do this at Kennedy Krieger. We know that autism is a disconnectivity syndrome. And so one of the questions that I have is, if we're able to intervene with children at the earliest points postnatally, can we really help develop a better connected brain? And so we want to optimize the healthiest possible brain development in children with autism spectrum disorders or at risk for it. And we can do this through early intervention, but first we have to find them. And so some of the burning questions are, who should be receiving treatment? How do we find the children who need treatment? And what should be treated? Well, one of the most efficient ways of studying this, if you want to find the earliest signs during infancy, is to find a population of children who are increased risk for displaying autism, and that is infant siblings of children with autism. So we've shown this in our work from my lab, but also in the consortium that's Autism Speaks supports us to come together once per year and supports the database into which each of us investigators donates a certain amount of data. So across all these studies, we found that nearly 20% of younger siblings of children with autism will also have an ASD, and about 30% will have a non-ASD related language and social delay by the third birthday. When we're, so in my particular study, I'm on my second baby SIB study now, digging deeper into things. And so these are the ages at which we test children, and we make the outcome diagnosis or classification at age 36 months. And at each age, we rate our confidence of the presence of ASD. And then at 36 months, we indicate whether or not a child meets our criteria for autism spectrum disorder, an intermediate phenotype like a language or social delay, or some other outcome. Usually the children are considered to be unaffected. Well, one of the things that we've learned from this work is that autism, there's a disruption in developmental processes that are intrinsic to the development of ASD. And in order to really understand when there's perturbation in development and what the cascading effects of this could be, we need to understand the trajectories of development. One of the things that I expected when I first started this work was that autism would look at 6 months like it looks at 6 years. We believed that the babies would be socially disengaged, would be overtly different from other babies their age. But as it turned out, for most babies, that's not true. And so if you're looking for that, you're going to miss the babies. You're looking under the wrong stone. And I just want to give an example of what a developmental cascade is, because I will be referring to this as I go through and show you videos of babies. If you have poor postural control, which we have found in most babies who go on to have autism at 6 months, you will have difficulty usually sitting. And if you have difficulty sitting independently at 6 months, which is the time at which you should be reaching out to objects and grasping them and exploring them, which is early play development, you're going to have difficulty doing that, and you're going to have difficulty getting yourself into a crawl position and being able to crawl on time. If you have a problem with that, you have difficulty focusing on the social world around you because it takes all of your attentional energy to do these things. This is going to lead to low object exploration, low social engagement, and eventually, likely, a delay in play and language development, as well as an impairment in social reciprocity. I want to make it clear that I don't believe that a problem with postural control is the only cause of autism in terms of the difficulties that emerge, but I do believe it could contribute to the autism phenotype, and it should be a player in considering the interventions. So I'm going to start with the 6-month findings. And one of the things I want to explain about research, and there's a lot of researchers in the audience, so this is probably doesn't need to be said, but you know, researchers look at group data. And so there are going to be babies who are exceptions to the rule, and this is one of those babies. This is a baby with his mom in a simple peekaboo task, and you can see that already at 6 months, he is showing pretty overt signs of autism, and he did go on to have autism, and he was quite severely affected. And we are still following him. He's a teenager now. Okay. So I was fearful of this. Okay, let's see if I can show you his video. So the mom has been trying to get his attention through the peekaboo for some time and was not successful. So she's a fantastic mother, very tuned into her baby, and started to play this little piggy game with him. And you can see he's really enjoying that, but he doesn't look at her. He has a repetitive raspberry action going on here.
Where's mommy?
So that's just a little glimpse into that for you. Now, oops. So here's a baby who also went on to have autism in the same task. This baby is showing a lot of signs of typical development in terms of the rhythmic movements of arms and legs, looking at his mom during this task. What we didn't realize then that we realize now is that peekaboo is a robustly exogenous cueing task for the babies. In other words, it's a very compelling drawing the baby's attention to the social stimulus. We now know that we need to be looking more at the baby's own endogenous willingness or being drawn into social attention. And so I won't have time to show this video, but in a paper that we published in 2010, we designed this novel task where we looked at learning in 6-month-olds to see how the babies would learn to activate a remote toy by operating a switch that was proximal to them. And so 45 degrees from midline to their right was the toy that would light up and make music when they activated the switch. And then over here, at the same angle away from them, is their caregiver. And so what we discovered, this was actually our first baby. This is a 5-month-old baby with neurotypical development, no family history of autism. As soon as this baby realized that it was her who was activating this toy, she did a 3-point gaze shift, that is looking from the toy to her mother and back to the toy. And we were astounded at that because no one had ever published that babies at this age initiate joint attention in that way. So this was sort of a huge breakthrough in child development. And what we found was that in baby siblings of children with autism, they looked over to their caregiver as often, but the duration of their social gaze was less. And now many sites are discovering this, that these are the subtleties that can be the early indicators of ASD. We also, found that babies who go on to have social and communication delays, including autism, show head lag at 6 months of age. This is supposed to be finished by 4 months, and I'll just show you what it looks like, what good head control looks like at age 6 months. And so this is a low-risk control who did not go on to have autism.
Come on up.
So if you can see this perfect alignment between the back of the head and the shoulders, did you see that? Okay, and so I also have to just escape out and show you this. Sorry, there are a couple videos that won't play in the PowerPoint. Here we go. This is a baby sibling of a child with autism who ended up with autism who does have the head lag. This is a severe case of it. We did this with this baby at least 20 times through the course of the session because we wanted to be sure this wasn't an artifact. But it was not an artifact. And it doesn't have to look that bad to qualify as head lag. So just in summary of the findings at 6 months, that if you measure babies with standardized tests at 6 months, like the Mullen scales of early learning, even the motor measures, these babies will score within normal limits. And so these quantitative measures do not detect the earliest signals of autism spectrum disorder. However, it's the qualitative aspects. And motor is a driving force, and it's a major indicator of later developmental delay that can include autism. Oftentimes, there's passivity in the infants, and also, as I said before, a reduction in duration of social attention. Over time, however, things change, obviously, and one of the things that we have identified is that, and of course any parent will tell you this, that there's heterogeneity in autism spectrum disorders in terms of onset patterns and trajectory. And so this is just a slide showing you something from a paper that we originally we published in 2007 with additional groups, other delay groups who did not have autism. But then we've replicated it with a separate sample in a recent publication. And so this is raw score on a receptive language measure from 6 to 36 months in the same children. This is not cross-sectional. And so this is the group who did not end up with autism spectrum disorder, but could have other delays. And you can see the proverbial growth spurt that happens in language development that you read about in textbooks in this group that's happening between 14 and 24 months. The growth curve between 6 and 14 months is identical between the babies who we did not identify with ASD at 14 months, but who we did identify with ASD at 36 months. So they're developing their receptive language skills perfectly within normal limits on this measure until 14 months, where they start to depart. They don't show the growth curve. That's where the problem is. And then for the children who we did identify with autism spectrum disorder at 14 months, who continue to display the disorder at 36 months, those children are already on a deceleration of language development before their first birthday, and then they have a virtual plateau between 14 and 18 months. So this just is an example of that diversity. Now, in terms of shared positive affect, and this is looking at people and smiling of your own volition. They're not trying to get you to smile. During a play activity, they independently shift their attention away from what they're doing, look at the person nearby, and smile at them. And so this is the trajectory of what's happening in about a 20-minute play sample with shared positive affect between 14 and 24 months of age. And this is playing with a stranger. So this is frequency of occurrence, and this is the group who did not end up with ASD, and this is the group who we diagnosed did not diagnose at 14 months, but had it at 36 months. And you can see they're looking at people and smiling. They're socially intact at this age, but they fall apart between 14 and 18 months and then continue to decline before the 24-month birthday. So something internally is coming apart. The wheels are coming off the bus, as they say. And so this is the group who we did diagnose at 14 months who still had autism at 36 months, and you can see that pretty much they're not able to mount the social engagement, social sharing of emotion with other people. And so I'll just show you real quickly a couple videos. So this is a child at 14 months of age in that very task. And so we've blown up a balloon and let it deflate, and then we laid it on the table. And this is what he did with it. First, he explored it a little bit. Then he handed to the person across the table, smiling and anticipating and really waiting for this fun thing. But even though he's excited about the balloon, he never forgets about the lady across the table. And this is a child at 14 months who did go on to have autism spectrum disorder. And he doesn't look at the people. And you can see, Dr. Harris had mentioned something about the sensory experiences, and you can see that even the feeling of this balloon is a bit objectionable to this child, and his mother has picked up on that and commented about it and kind of imitated his movement. And so this is what, he doesn't really see other people as an affordance to socially engage or to help him move on to doing something different with the balloon. But I wanted you to see that because autism at this age is often missed. One of the things that we wanted to understand as we're trying to understand these differences in developmental trajectory for children with autism, we also wanted to understand differences in developmental trajectory for the siblings of children with autism who don't go on to have autism. So with some collaborators here, Dr. Stewart and Dr. Gross, and I want to also acknowledge my colleague from Boston, Dr. Margaret Bauman, who also collected data for this study. We did something called a latent class growth curve analysis, which does not require that you make any judgments whatsoever clinically about the children. You just put the data in, and it will generate the different classes of development. And so on this test, between 40 and 60 is a within normal limits score. A standard deviation below and above that is substantially different from the norm. And you can see that in this group of children here that we call the accelerated class, everybody at 6 months pretty much starts out right at the mean. But in certain aspects of development, specifically their nonverbal cognitive ability and their receptive and expressive language ability, they exceed the norm by the time they're 36 months. So they really have accelerated development. This is the normative class. In this normative class, you will notice that in this particular group, these children got off to a very rocky start with receptive language, and they even, in fact, almost extend below a standard deviation below the mean, but then they pull themselves back up. This is a group of kids in the baby siblings group, and we had about 204 kids in this sample. They started off within normal limits, but we have a lot of diversity across developmental domains. And in this group, we see a pretty significant rocky start to receptive language, and it lingers delayed between 14 and 18 months, starts to pick itself up between 18 and 24 months, ends up okay, but we end up with a fine motor delay. And in this group of developmental slowing, these are T-scores, that is their standard, their age adjusted. So this does not mean regression, although there are some children with regression in this group, but these are developmental decelerations. So this is what's happening to the language system. It's happening to everything, but language falls off first. Motor and cognition falls off later. So just so you can see how the children with autism were distributed across these classes, children who with the early onset autism spectrum disorder pattern, None of them were in the accelerated class. 14% were in the normative class. About a third were in the delayed class, and over half were in the developmental slowing class. So this is just to show you that even within individuals with early or later onset patterns, there's still a lot of diversity in trajectory patterns. So I'm going to summarize this and end by a few words about intervention. At 6 months, as I've said before, we have subtle signs of problems. They involve initiative and motor development. Per work from Joe Piven's IBIS network, we already know that there's pre-behavioral abnormalities, differences in white fiber tracts in 6-month-old siblings of children with autism, and in particular, those who go on to have score high on the gold standard autism assessment, even if they don't have a firm diagnosis of autism. We also know that there are different phenotypes within the autism spectrum disorder. We also know that between 6 and 14 months, there's already a very shaky start to development. Then between 14 and 24 months, there's a major hit to the system. Nonverbal cognition is the most resilient, and repetitive and stereotype patterns present as early as 6 months. I didn't show you the data on that, but they already are there in some children by 6 months. And again, this is the motor system. But by 24 months, as many children as are going to have these abnormalities already have them. And I mention this because so many people told me as I was coming through my training in autism that repetitive and stereotype patterns of behavior in children with autism do not appear before the 3rd birthday. It's just not true. So this work has led me to develop interventions for children between 12 and 24 months of age, and now we're moving into developing preventative, I shouldn't use the word preventive, but interventions that might be able to help build this connectivity even more powerfully during the infancy period. And so I just want to emphasize 4 main qualities of early intervention that we might want to even think about on a global perspective, and that is that we really do have to emphasize self-generated action. This literature is just simply clear. It's clear in the neurotypical literature, and we're finding it to be clear in our work that when children are actively involved in the intervention activities, as opposed to being passive recipients in a discrete trial, they are, their learning is more accelerated and more generalized. We also do have to use highly motivating and child rewarding things because, and this is called child responsiveness intervention, it really helps children store the information in their memories for longer periods of time. We also want to use routines-based intervention. This is from the Hebbian principle, neurons that fire together, wire together. And so we really want babies building their simple behavioral repertoires and then expanding them systematically. Parents can learn to do this in their everyday diapering, bathing, and feeding routines, and then supporting families through using adult learning models, as Dr. Mandell already said. So I want to show you these principles in action. So this is our 1-year-old intervention. These children all have real autism. This is near the, I would say, 3/4 of the way through the treatment. The parents are not separated from the children until about this time. We use a heavy-duty parent adult learning model here, which I won't have time to tell you about, but it really transforms the families. Doing this in a group setting really strengthens the families' bonds. They continue to babysit for each other. Some of these families from the earliest interventions, 5, 6 years later, are still celebrate holidays together, Thanksgiving, birthdays. It's a beautiful thing. So
we wash the table, wash the table, wash the table.
So what we do is that we give the children these cloths, and this is an ecologically valid activity. What happens when you give the cloth is that the children start to flip it, and then they start to rub it on the table. But out of the corner of their eye, so this is a really special day. But out of the corner of their eye, they see the other children doing it. And so now we have a joint action routine Everyone's doing it. This turns into spontaneous imitation. This turns into language because of the routine and how the language is mapped onto their own actions. And then we build the event more and more complicated as the children get competent with each part. So now we've expanded it to actually requiring that they put their cloths in the trash. Now I wanted to show you this clip as well, because this is us with the parents in the classroom and teaching them how to do this with their own children. And one of the things that we have the children do at a very young age, once they begin to self-regulate and learn to touch objects and become aware that there are other children in their presence, and believe me, that takes its own time. It takes a while. But then we get them to regulate the behavior of others and to look to others for signals about how to regulate their own behavior. So this little boy is being coached to send, okay, I want you to go down, and then, oh, did it stop, or did I stop it? Okay. And so the little guy who's on the slide then is following the cues of his peer, which is preparing these children for So this is a process, and not all children have the same degree of response, but all children respond to the intervention, at least at this age. And we know that autism is a moving target, and there are periods of regression. This is a neurobiological disorder, but this is just to show that these brains are plastic, and there are things that we can do behaviorally, and there's much more work to be done. And I'll close with that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Landa. So we thought it would be great to end the day with a more discussion-based presentation. And so I think the idea was Michelle Landrums, who I will recognize, or Dr. Pietro will recognize at the end. But the idea is that our center already, even before it was called a center, has a history. And that is that after Wendy's death, the money that came in memoriam of Wendy was already put in a special place to support work in autism and developmental disabilities. And Dean Klag, through partnership with Chris Smith that you're about to meet, and some others, started the Wendy Klag Scholars, which was simply a placement program that if there were students in the school that were interested in having a kind of internship experience to see what it means to work in developmental disabilities in some aspect with sort of public health bend to it, that they could have that opportunity. And so we thought it would be great to end by having one of the students who had that experience share with you his experience, both in terms of the placement itself, but we also thought it would be great to invite the mentors that he was exposed to tell you about their experience, because I hope that as students in the room you'll see what a great opportunity it could be, but also as faculty and community partners in the room, you'll see that from the mentor perspective it is also a great experience. So with that, we'd love to invite all four of you up. So Dr. Ben Zablotsky is a graduate of the Department of Mental Health here in the School of Public Health and was the mentee in this experience. And then Dr. Chris Smith, who I mentioned, who really has shepherded this, is director of the Maryland Center for Developmental Disabilities at the Kennedy Krieger Institute, and who really oversees and still does the placement of students into these programs. Dr. Liz Stewart, who is an associate professor in our Department of Mental Health as well as in the Department of Biostatistics here at Hopkins. And Luke Kalb, who is now a doctoral student in the Department of Mental Health, but at the time of this experience was a data analyst for the Autism Treatment Network that is actually funded by Autism Speaks, but part of the operations that were happening at Kennedy Krieger. They all came together, you can already see, from diverse backgrounds. So we just wanted them to informally sort of share that experience with you. So welcome.
Of his experience and what he's been doing since then. So we'll start with Ben, and then we'll open it up for more general discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Liz. So my little talk today is basically on collaborating on autism research as a student, or how I took advantage of being a Klag Scholar. So just a quick introduction about myself. I am a 2012 graduate from the mental health department. I received my PhD from the department. And as you can see, my time as a Klag Scholar influenced my dissertation, which was raising a child with an autism spectrum disorder, links with mental health, family stress, and school functioning. Currently, I am an Associate Service Fellow at the National Center for Health Statistics, which is part of the CDC. So just a quick background, how I came to reach my product and project as a Klag Scholar, which was the launching of a bullying survey through the Interactive Autism Network. I'd been working with my advisor, Dr. Catherine Bradshaw, and we were working on bullying research. And I found that the majority of the literature was really dedicated to a regular education population. There were very few studies that looked at children with special healthcare needs and receiving special education services in terms of their bullying involvement and how often they were victimized. And among the children with special education services, there were even fewer studies that looked at children with autism. I found the studies that did look at autism were really restricted in the population they were focused on. A lot of them were looking at high-functioning autism, children with Asperger's, and a lot of times the studies looked at children who were older. So I had been working with Dr. Paul Law at the Interactive Autism Network, and I saw it as an incredible opportunity to reach out to a population of families of children with ASDs to better understand what it looks like across the spectrum for children in terms of their schooling. So we launched the Bullying and School Experiences of Children with ASD survey, not very glamorous, but to the point. And there were over 1,200 families who partaked, and we looked at what children were at risk for being bullied among the spectrum, if there were particular subgroups that were at greater risk, and we were also interested at what some of the psychological consequences might be of children who are bullied. And I won't share that with you today, but I will leave the reference list at the end of the slides if you're interested in learning more. I also, during my time as a Klag Scholar, worked directly with Dr. Christopher Smith through the Maryland Center for Developmental Disabilities. And together we looked at parental school involvement and satisfaction with schools among parents of children with ASDs. Working with Kate Boswell as well, we looked at the prevalence of autism in schools in Maryland. And working with Maureen Van Stone through Project HEAL, we were interested in figuring out how to better capture bullying incidents in Maryland schools. There's currently a form that teachers and staff fill out when there is a bullying incident. We wanted to see how we might be able to improve that form moving forward. So finally, before I lead it to the panel, I had some other collaborations with members of Kennedy Krieger at the Center for Autism and Related Disorders in Luther Kalb, and staff from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and Dr. Elizabeth Stewart. And I see Maria Stacy in the back, and Lee Ching Lee, I don't know if she's here. There she is. We worked on a project as well looking at comorbidity among males and females and if there were gender differences. So just a quick list of some of the products from all these collaborations. The top 3 starred ones are working in the Interactive Autism Network and that bullying survey. And now I'll move back over. Actually, I should leave that up.
Thanks, Ben. I'll say one quick note, and then I'm going to hand it over to the others, but it was nice. I was sitting next to a student earlier who said, a current student earlier who said, wow, it's so great to see all of the, all the former students and all the great things that they're doing. So it's been really nice today to see the former students, some former students, and what they're doing, and now we can talk about more of the current student experience. I think Dr. Smith will start if you want to just say a few words about your experience with this process.
Who is this guy? Well, I came here about 4.5 or 5 years ago at the invitation of Dr. Goldstein to work here at Kennedy Krieger. It's been a real honor ever since to work with a lot of the esteemed colleagues here in the room, both at Hopkins, and I have colleagues here from Towson and many other places as well. It was a great experience to work here. I first got directed to Janet DiPietro, who then introduced me to Dean Klag, who immediately said, well, of course this makes sense, and committed to this wonderful partnership that ended up with us having 6 or 7 of the Klag scholars now here. We've had about 70 or 75 trainees in the last 4.5 to 5 years. It's been a really interesting, demanding, but very, very productive set of relationships. And Ben and the other students come in extremely well prepared. I can tell you we are incredibly happy, and and fond of them by the time they leave. I hope they're as fond of us as we are of them. It's an incredible relationship. They get to come in and participate in research and policy analysis. We have large statewide training grants where they get to take part in the actual writing and development and implementation of large statewide projects. We get to develop, as you can see, papers and posters and other products together. We feel like it's a great exposure for them to have some real life involvement in both adults and early childhood and school-age services. We do a lot of program evaluation efforts, so they've been helping us with a lot of databases and data systems as well. So we tend to work, I work as a director of a center that's one of 67 around the country. So every state has at least one center like ours. Some have 2 or 3, some of the bigger states. We happen to be the only center in Maryland, and I'm the director of that. So I feel very fortunate to have not only an association with these young, bright students, but also many colleagues like the ones at Towson and Hopkins here. We hope to continue. We have many, many more lined up this year. We have some great, we've had students from Coppin State and Morgan State and Sojourner Douglas, and we feel like it's a great start to what we hope will be a long-term productive development of these sort of interdisciplinary pre-service training options. We've had undergraduates, we've had masters, we've had doctoral, and now we've had postdocs as well.
Great, thank you. Now I'll have Luke Kolb say a few words. You'll probably say this, but Luke, I think, brings a nice perspective, having worked previously at Kennedy Krieger and now as a doctoral student in mental health, as Danny had mentioned. And so Luke sort of is coming sort of from the opposite side of having a lot of the hands-on experience and now moving more into the research side. So talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Liz. So yeah, I have a kind of a unique experience I'd like to share with you of kind of how I've come from being a student here and getting my master's degree to leaving and then coming back. So I'm just interested, how many people here are students right now at the school? Okay. So, you know, one thing everybody grapples with, especially with this economy, is, you know, where can you actually get a job after you graduate? And how do you go about doing that? So I got my master's degree here in 2008, and I was fortunate enough to meet Dr. Landa and take a position over at Kennedy Krieger Center for Autism-Related Disorders, because there was funding made available to work on the ETN as a data manager. And after working there for a couple years, my boss at the time, Brian Friedman, who's now at the University of Delaware, came to me one day and he said, "I really want to study divorce and autism." And I said, "Me too. I'm really interested in that." And he said, "There's nothing good out there. We should figure out how to do this." And I said, "I agree." I said, "But we need help." And he said, "Okay." He's like, "I'm going to go to Dr. Landa and ask for help." And we went to her, and she provided us with a link to Liz to help us with survey methodologies. And she then connected us to Ben. And we had this group of 4 people, and we got together. And through that collaboration, we not only published one of the first studies about divorce and autism, which unfortunately is not up here, but that's another paper that was published, got a fair amount of publicity. Brian went on to present that at IMFAR. It was selected as one of the 5 most interesting or high quality, I'm not sure how you deem it, but studies for 2008. And we were really excited by that, and we ended up, that group stayed together. The 4 of us, we ended up picking up another collaborator, Roma Vasa, who's a child psychiatrist over at CARD. And we've produced several different papers. You can see Ben did a study that was recently accepted to psychiatric services, looking at the influence of family income on health service utilization. I did a study on emergency department use. And Roma's got a paper on anxiety as well. So we've developed a great collaborative network. And recently, we've all started dispersing. I now am over here working on my doctorate in my first year, and Dr. Stewart is my advisor. And that grew directly out of that collaboration, I believe. Ben has now gone on, and he now works in the CDC, Center for Health Statistics. So I like to think that all of our work together has blossomed each of our career. So it's been a really exciting 4 years, and it was a very productive time as well. So I think I look forward to continuing to work together, all of us. And so thank you for inviting me.
So that's a nice segue to one thing that I was going to ask Ben to talk more about, which is sort of moving forward. And these placements, students are here for a few years. The placements officially happen for some short period of time or shortish. So can you just talk a little bit about how that has then changed sort of your trajectory moving forward and how it's changed your broader research interests and plans?
And I think a lot of it was not only, starting some collaborations while I was a scholar, but then continuing them forward and feeling like I was then prepared to take the lead on a lot of projects. So I think that was a really big part of it. And the interesting thing is the initial data set that we worked on as a team looking at the family structure paper turned out to be a data set from the center that I'm now an employee of. So I came in very well prepared because I already knew their data sets very well. But I think in terms of really understanding how to work as a research team, I developed those skills greatly and really had a sense of autonomy at the same time that I could help lead something in the future. So, yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Please.
So the funny part about the divorce paper is we wanted to study divorce, and we published a paper about divorce, but we actually never measured divorce. But there was so little out there that what we had was a whole lot better than anything anybody had. But what's interesting is I recently saw on a survey there was a question about, a more detailed question about family structure and about divorce, and it's gained a lot of attention recently. So that's exciting. I'd like to think that some of the questions that they added to the survey was influenced by some of the limitations that we talked about in our paper and the difficulty with measuring that.
This is a great thing about the students. They live, eat, and breathe this stuff.
That's what I was going to say was one thing that's wonderful as a faculty member is getting this exposure to students who have so much energy and excitement, and they really help us move the research forward. One of the other things I very much appreciate being here at Hopkins is the interdisciplinary nature of so much of what we do. Even this panel, my PhD is in statistics, we sort of represent a broad variety. So I don't know if each of you could maybe just talk a little about sort of how the interdisciplinary nature of the work sort of influences what you do, and even just the Ben, I was trying to remember your dissertation committee, but I think it was, a psychologist and maybe a psychiatrist and a statistician, and you sort of just talk a little about that.
Sure. I think you really do get a lot of different perspectives, and there are, my committee members, you were a statistician in my committee, and Dr. Smith was also on my committee. Dr. Wilcox was on my committee as well. So you really got a really wide range of expertise, and I think you were able to build upon that, as you started to ask research questions, even an educator's perspective when it comes to looking at prevalence of ASDs in the school. I found that, it really was the interdisciplinary nature of my research and getting those different perspectives that allows you to be a little more open-minded when you ask various research questions, which was helpful. And I don't know if...
Yeah, working at Kennedy in the Center for Autism, I can't think of a more multidisciplinary environment. I mean, there's occupational therapists, physicians, pediatricians, anybody that it's such a multifactorial disorder that CARD is developed to touch each of those areas with the children. So, going over there with a public health perspective was nice. And with a research background. And I think that we need to continue to link academic institutions with clinical environments because there's such a give and take there. They each have their own specialties, and a lot of the most important questions we have to ask come from clinical observations. And the methodology component that's forwarded here at the School of Public Health needs to be translated over to them as well. So that's what's amazing about this. That's exactly what the Wendy Klag Center is developing that bridge between these two institutions. So that's really exciting, and I hope that continues to bear fruit in the future.
And so Ben, I was also then going to ask you to, you are still working even with the shutdown. So could you tell us a little more about your position now and sort of how what you've learned through the center has contributed to what you're doing now and that sort of thing?
Sure. A lot of it is in terms of the methodology, in terms of learning how to analyze statistical data, understanding how a survey is conducted, and understanding potential sampling biases that can exist when you are recruiting a sample. I feel that the exposure I had prepared me so well for the position, obviously using a similar data set, but at the same time really understanding from a population level how research can be conducted. So combining not only autism on a family level, on a clinical level, but also expanding it to a population level at the same time.
Any final comments from our panel members?
I think I just comment that one of the things I guess that this kind of a collaboration reminds me of is that all change happens at the individual level. We can work and we can do research at the aggregate level. We can work with control groups. We can talk about all the great research that my colleagues like Becky, Landa, and others are doing, Li Chang, at the population level. When it comes to students and training and interdisciplinary work, it all happens at the individual level. And so we just really try to stay focused on making sure that as the students come in, we have a plan. We've got some experiences that are really, really committed to, at that singular individual level, making a difference in that person's career and pathway. So hopefully that's happening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys can hang out there if you want, because I'd like to open it up very, very quickly for any questions for Dr. Black, Dr. Landa, or the panelists.
Good to see you again.
I think Dr. Kaiser would like to have some closing remarks. Any questions? Is John going to stretch a little bit? Was there one? Sorry. Just a minute.
So I was curious if there's any sort of multi-specialty clinical tracking going on. In other words, is CARD doing anything around clinical tracking of potential triggers for the developmental regressions for postural or grasp issues, things like tracking fevers or disease or potentially silent seizures, toxins, mitochondrial disorders, constipation, diarrhea, and issues of excretion of toxins, things like that.
Thank you for that question. It's such an important one. Yes, in that, and thanks to Luke for really, and Dr. Law for creating our clinical research registry at CARD. So all families who come through, we're able to archive in a systematic way their medical information. We see about 1,200 new patients a year and about 3,200 patients a year in total. So we're able to get, now that's from infancy through the late teens. So over time, we'll be able to look at those various things.
Can I make one more comment to that? Thank you, Dr. Landa. Yeah, so we fast track kids with regression and other medical issues that come in. I say we, sorry. I'm now here. I spent 5 years over there. It's part of my identity, always will be. And the physicians follow them. Dr. DiPimenez is the medical director, and they treat those kids over time and follow them up. So they're very attentive to it. And Dr. Menon actually has a specialty in regression. She's part of an ATN study looking at genetic biomarkers. So it's well attended to.
One of the things that we've become incredibly sensitized to regression. And we've also learned from Dr. Richard Kelly, who's an expert in metabolic disorders, that as we're treating children in our clinical work at CARD, when we see a child start to show declines in treatment, I mean, we do not mess around with that. So if he comes in on Tuesday, the child comes in on Tuesday and he's not performing like he did on Monday, we check in with the parent. Could there be a ear infection? What's going on? Did he have sleep last night? Anything going on with his diet? And really, we don't let time go by. So the great news is that we do catch regressions right when they're happening for children that we're treating. If a parent calls, like Luke said, and has any suspicion that their child is regressing, those children are seen immediately.
Other questions? Okay, well, let's thank all the speakers again, and then